Chapter 7. The mesa was like a ship becalmed in a strait of lion-colored dust. The channel wound between precipitous banks, and slanting from one wall to the other across the valley, ran a streak of green, the river and its fields. On the prow of that stone ship in the center of the strait, and seemingly a part of it, a shaped and geometrical outcrop of the naked rock, stood the pueblo of Malpais. Block above block, each story smaller than the one below, the tall houses rose like stepped and amputated pyramids into the blue sky. At their feet lay a straggle of low buildings, a criss-cross of walls, and on three sides the precipices fell sheer into the plain. A few columns of smoke mounted perpendicularly into the windless air and were lost. "Queer," said Lenina. "Very queer." It was her ordinary word of condemnation. "I don't like it, and I don't like that man." She pointed to the Indian guide, who had been appointed to take them up to the pueblo. Her feeling was evidently reciprocated. The very back of the man, as he walked along before them, was hostile, sullenly contemptuous. Besides, she lowered her voice, "He smells." Bernard did not attempt to deny it. They walked on. Suddenly it was as though the whole air had come alive, and were pulsing with the indefatigable movement of blood. Up there, in Malpais, the drums were being beaten. Their feet fell in with the rhythm of that mysterious heart. They quickened their pace. Their path led them to the foot of the precipice. The sides of the great mesa ship towered over them, 300 feet to the gunwale. "I wish we could have brought the plane," said Lenina, looking up resentfully at the blank impending rock face. "I hate walking, and you feel so small when you're on the ground at the bottom of a hill." They walked along for some way in the shadow of the mesa, rounded a projection. And there, in a water-worn ravine, was the way up the companion ladder. They climbed. It was a very steep path that zigzagged from side to side of the gully. Sometimes the pulsing of the drums was all but inaudible, at others they seemed to be beating only just round the corner. When they were halfway up, an eagle flew past, so close to them that the wind of his wings blew chill on their faces. In a crevice of the rock lay a pile of bones. It was all oppressively queer, and the Indian smelt stronger and stronger. They emerged at last from the ravine into the full sunlight. The top of the mesa was a flat deck of stone. "Like the Charing Tea Tower," was Lenina's comment. But she was not allowed to enjoy her discovery of this reassuring resemblance for long. A padding of soft feet made them turn round. Naked from throat to navel, their dark brown bodies painted with white lines, like asphalt tennis courts, Lenina was later to explain, their faces inhuman with daubings of scarlet, black and ochre. Two Indians came running along the path. Their black hair was braided with fox fur and red flannel. Cloaks of turkey feathers fluttered from their shoulders. Huge feather diadems exploded gaudily round their heads. With every step they took came the clink and rattle of their silver bracelets, their heavy necklaces of bone and turquoise beads. They came on without a word, running quietly in their deerskin moccasins. One of them was holding a feather brush. The other carried, in either hand, what looked at a distance like 3 or 4 pieces of thick rope. One of the ropes writhed uneasily, and suddenly Lenina saw that they were snakes. The men came nearer and nearer. Their dark eyes looked at her, but without giving any sign of recognition, any smallest sign that they had seen her or were aware of her existence. The writhing snake hung limp again with the rest. The men passed. "I don't like it," said Lenina. "I don't like it." She liked even less what awaited her at the entrance to the pueblo, where their guide had left them while he went inside for instructions. The dirt, to start with, the piles of rubbish, the dust, the dogs, the flies. Her face wrinkled up into a grimace of disgust. She held her handkerchief to her nose. "But how can they live like this?" she broke out in a voice of indignant incredulity. It wasn't possible. Bernard shrugged his shoulders philosophically. "Anyhow," he said, "they've been doing it for the last 5 or 6,000 years, so I suppose they must be used to it by now." "But cleanliness is next to forwardliness," she insisted. "Yes, and civilization is sterilization," Bernard went on, concluding on a tone of irony. "The second hypnopedic lesson in elementary hygiene. But these people have never heard of our Ford, and they aren't civilized. So there's no point in." "Oh." She gripped his arm. "Look." An almost naked Indian was very slowly climbing down the ladder. from the first-floor terrace of a neighboring house, rung after rung, with the tremulous caution of extreme old age. His face was profoundly wrinkled and black, like a mask of obsidian. The toothless mouth had fallen in, at the corners of the lips, and on each side of the chin. A few long bristles gleamed almost white against the dark skin. The long unbraided hair hung down in gray wisps round his face. His body was bent and emaciated to the bone, almost fleshless. Very slowly he came down, pausing at each rung before he ventured another step. "What's the matter with him?" whispered Lenina. Her eyes were wide with horror and amazement. "He's old, that's all," Bernard answered as carelessly as he could. He too was startled, but he made an effort to seem unmoved. "Old?" she repeated. "But the director's old. Lots of people are old, they're not like that." "That's because we don't allow them to be like that. We preserve them from diseases. We keep their internal secretions artificially balanced. At a youthful equilibrium, we don't permit their magnesium-calcium ratio to fall below what it was at 30. We give them transfusions of young blood. We keep their metabolism permanently stimulated. So, of course, they don't look like that. Partly," he added, "because most of them die long before they reach this old creature's age. Youth almost unimpaired till 60, and then, crack. The end." But Lenina was not listening. She was watching the old man. Slowly he came down. His feet touched the ground. He turned. In their deep sunken orbits his eyes were still extraordinarily bright. They looked at her for a long moment expressionlessly, without surprise. As though she had not been there at all. Then slowly, with bent back, the old man hobbled past them and was gone. "But it's terrible," Lenina whispered. "It's awful. We ought not to have come here." She felt in her pocket for her Soma, only to discover that, by some unprecedented oversight, she had left the bottle down at the rest house. Bernard's pockets were also empty. Lenina was left to face the horrors of Malpais unaided. They came crowding in on her thick and fast. The spectacle of two young women giving the breast to their babies made her blush and turn away her face. She had never seen anything so indecent in her life. And what made it worse was that, instead of tactfully ignoring it, Bernard proceeded to make open comments on this revoltingly viviparous scene, ashamed, now that the effects of the soma had worn off, of the weakness he had displayed that morning in the hotel. He went out of his way to show himself strong and unorthodox. "What a wonderfully intimate relationship," he said, deliberately outrageous. "And what an intensity of feeling it must generate. I often think one may have missed something in not having had a mother." "And perhaps you've missed something in not being a mother, Lenina. Imagine yourself sitting there with a little baby of your own. Bernard, how can you?" The passage of an old woman with ophthalmia and a disease of the skin distracted her from her indignation. "Let's go away," she begged. "I don't like it." But at this moment their guide came back and, beckoning to them to follow, led the way down the narrow street between the houses. They rounded a corner. A dead dog was lying on a rubbish heap. A woman with a goiter was looking for lice in the hair of a small girl. Their guide halted at the foot of a ladder, raised his hand perpendicularly, then darted it horizontally forward. They did what he mutely commanded, climbed the ladder and walked through the doorway, to which it gave access, into a long narrow room, rather dark and smelling of smoke and cooked grease and long unwashed clothes. At the further end of the room was another doorway, through which came a shaft of sunlight and the noise, very loud and close, of the drums. They stepped across the threshold and found themselves on a wide terrace. Below them, shut in by the tall houses, was the village square, crowded with Indians, bright blankets and feathers in black hair, and the glint of turquoise and dark skins shining with heat. Lenina put her handkerchief to her nose again. In the open space at the center of the square were two circular platforms of masonry and trampled clay, the roofs, it was evident, of underground chambers, for in the center of each platform was an open hatchway, with a ladder emerging from the lower darkness. A sound of subterranean flute playing came up and was almost lost in the steady, remorseless persistence of the drums. Lenina liked the drums. Shutting her eyes, she abandoned herself to their soft repeated thunder, allowed it to invade her consciousness more and more completely, till at last there was nothing left in the world but that one deep pulse of sound. It reminded her reassuringly of the synthetic noises made at solidarity services and Ford's Day celebrations. Orgy porgy, she whispered to herself. These drums beat out just the same rhythms. There was a sudden startling burst of singing, hundreds of male voices crying out fiercely in harsh metallic unison. A few long notes and silence, the thunderous silence of the drums, then shrill, in a neighing treble, the women's answer. Then again the drums and once more. The men's deep savage affirmation of their manhood. Queer, yes. The place was queer, so was the music. So were the clothes and the goiters and the skin diseases and the old people. But the performance itself, there seemed to be nothing specially queer about that. It reminds me of a lower caste community sing, she told Bernard. But a little later it was reminding her a good deal less of that innocuous function. For suddenly there had swarmed up from those round chambers underground a ghastly troop of monsters. Hideously masked or painted out of all semblance of humanity, they had tramped out a strange, limping dance round the square round. And again round, singing as they went, round and round, each time a little faster. And the drums had changed and quickened their rhythm, so that it became like the pulsing of fever in the ears. And the crowd had begun to sing with the dancers. Louder and louder, and first one woman had shrieked, and then another and another. As though they were being killed, and then suddenly the leader of the dancers broke out of the line, ran to a big wooden chest, which was standing at one end of the square, raised the lid and pulled out a pair of black snakes. A great yell went up from the crowd, and all the other dancers ran towards him with outstretched hands. He tossed the snakes to the first comers, then dipped back into the chest for more. More and more, black snakes and brown and mottled, he flung them out. And then the dance began again on a different rhythm. Round and round they went with their snakes. Snakily, with a soft undulating movement at the knees and hips. Round and round. Then the leader gave a signal, and one after another. All the snakes were flung down in the middle of the square. An old man came up from underground and sprinkled them with cornmeal, and from the other hatchway came a woman and sprinkled them with water from a black jar. Then the old man lifted his hand and, startlingly, terrifyingly, there was absolute silence. The drums stopped beating, life seemed to have come to an end. The old man pointed towards the two hatchways that gave entrance to the lower world, and slowly, raised by invisible hands from below, there emerged from the one a painted image of an eagle, from the other that of a man, naked, and nailed to a cross. They hung there, seemingly self-sustained, as though watching. The old man clapped his hands. Naked but for a white cotton breech cloth. A boy of about 18 stepped out of the crowd and stood before him. His hands crossed over his chest, his head bowed. The old man made the sign of the cross over him and turned away. Slowly, the boy began to walk round the writhing heap of snakes. He had completed the first circuit and was halfway through the second when, from among the dancers, a tall man wearing the mask of a coyote and holding in his hand a whip of plaited leather, advanced towards him. The boy moved on as though unaware of the other's existence. The coyote man raised his whip. There was a long moment of expectancy. Then a swift movement, the whistle of the lash and its loud, flat-sounding impact on the flesh. The boy's body quivered but he made no sound. He walked on at the same slow, steady pace. The coyote struck again, and at every blow at first, a gasp and then a deep groan went up from the crowd. The boy walked on. Twice, thrice, 4 times round he went. The blood was streaming. 5 times round, 6 times round. Suddenly Lenina covered her face with her hands and began to sob. "Oh, stop them," she implored. But the whip fell and fell inexorably. 7 times round. Then all at once the boy staggered and, still without a sound, pitched forward onto his face. Bending over him, the old man touched his back with a long white feather. Held it up for a moment, crimson, for the people to see. Then shook it thrice over the snakes. A few drops fell, and suddenly the drums broke out again. Into a panic of hurrying notes there was a great shout. The dancers rushed forward, picked up the snakes and ran out of the square. Men, women, children, all the crowd ran after them. A minute later the square was empty, only the boy remained, prone, where he had fallen, quite still. 3 old women came out of one of the houses, and with some difficulty, lifted him and carried him in. The eagle and the man on the cross kept guard for a little while over the empty pueblo, then, as though they had seen enough, sank slowly down through their hatchways, out of sight, into the nether world. Lenina was still sobbing. Too awful, she kept repeating, and all Bernard's consolations were in vain. Too awful. That blood. She shuddered. Oh, I wish I had my soma. There was the sound of feet in the inner room. Lenina did not move, but sat with her face in her hands, unseeing, apart. Only Bernard turned round. The dress of the young man who now stepped out onto the terrace was Indian. But his plaited hair was straw-colored, his eyes a pale blue, and his skin a white skin, bronzed. "Hello. Good morrow," said the stranger, in faultless but peculiar English. "You're civilized, aren't you? You come from the other place, outside the reservation? Who on earth?" Bernard began in astonishment. The young man sighed and shook his head. "A most unhappy gentleman," and, pointing to the bloodstains in the center of the square. "Do you see that damned spot?" he asked in a voice that trembled with emotion. "A gram is better than a dam," said Lenina, mechanically from behind her hands. "I wish I had my soma. I ought to have been there." The young man went on. "Why wouldn't they let me be the sacrifice? I'd have gone round 10 times, 12, 15. Palawiwa only got as far as 7. They could have had twice as much blood from me." The multitudinous seas incarnadine. He flung out his arms in a lavish gesture. Then, despairingly, let them fall again. "But they wouldn't let me. They disliked me for my complexion. It's always been like that. Always." Tears stood in the young man's eyes. He was ashamed and turned away. Astonishment made Lenina forget the deprivation of soma. She uncovered her face and, for the first time, looked at the stranger. "Do you mean to say that you wanted to be hit with that whip?" Still averted from her, the young man made a sign of affirmation. "For the sake of the pueblo, to make the rain come and the corn grow. And to please Pukong and Jesus. And then to show that I can bear pain without crying out. Yes," and his voice suddenly took on a new resonance. He turned with a proud squaring of the shoulders. A proud, defiant lifting of the chin, to show that I'm a man. Oh. He gave a gasp and was silent, gaping. He had seen, for the first time in his life, the face of a girl whose cheeks were not the color of chocolate or dogskin. Whose hair was auburn and permanently waved. And whose expression, amazing novelty, was one of benevolent interest. Lenina was smiling at him, such a nice-looking boy. She was thinking, and a really beautiful body. The blood rushed up into the young man's face. He dropped his eyes, raised them again for a moment, only to find her still smiling at him, and was so much overcome that he had to turn away and pretend to be looking very hard at something on the other side of the square. Bernard's questions made a diversion. Who? How? When? From where? Keeping his eyes fixed on Bernard's face, for so passionately did he long to see Lenina smiling that he simply dared not look at her. The young man tried to explain himself. Linda was his mother. The word made Lenina look uncomfortable. Were strangers in the reservation. Linda had come from the other place long ago. Before he was born, with a man who was his father. Bernard pricked up his ears. She had gone walking alone in those mountains over there to the north, had fallen down a steep place and hurt her head. Go on, said Bernard excitedly. Some hunters from Malpais had found her and brought her to the pueblo. As for the man who was his father, Linda had never seen him again. His name was Tomakin. Yes, Thomas was the DHC's first name. He must have flown away, back to the other place, away without her, a bad, unkind, unnatural man. And so I was born in Malpais, he concluded. In Malpais. And he shook his head. The squalor of that little house on the outskirts of the pueblo. A space of dust and rubbish separated it from the village. 2 famine-stricken dogs were nosing obscenely in the garbage at its door inside. When they entered, the twilight stank and was loud with flies. Linda, the young man called. From the inner room a rather hoarse female voice said, coming. They waited. In bowls on the floor were the remains of a meal, perhaps of several meals. The door opened. A very stout blonde squaw stepped across the threshold and stood looking at the strangers. Staring incredulously, her mouth open. Lenina noticed with disgust that 2 of the front teeth were missing. And the color of the ones that remained. She shuddered. It was worse than the old man. So fat. And all the lines in her face, the flabbiness, the wrinkles. And the sagging cheeks, with those purplish blotches. And the red veins on her nose, the bloodshot eyes. And that neck. And the blanket she wore over her head, ragged and filthy. And under the brown sack-shaped tunic those enormous breasts. The bulge of the stomach, the hips. Oh, much worse than the old man. Much worse. And suddenly the creature burst out in a torrent of speech. Rushed at her with outstretched arms and, Ford. It was too revolting. In another moment she'd be sick, pressed her against the bulge, the bosom, and began to kiss her. Ford, to kiss, slobberingly, and smelt too horrible. Obviously never had a bath, and simply reeked of that beastly stuff that was put into Delta and Epsilon bottles. No, it wasn't true about Bernard, positively stank of alcohol. She broke away as quickly as she could. A blubbered and distorted face confronted her. The creature was crying. Oh, my dear, my dear. The torrent of words flowed sobbingly. If you knew how glad, after all these years. A civilized face. Yes, and civilized clothes. Because I thought I should never see a piece of real acetate silk again. She fingered the sleeve of Lenina's shirt. The nails were black. And those adorable viscose velveteen shorts. Do you know, dear? I've still got my old clothes, the ones I came in, put away in a box. I'll show them you afterwards. Though, of course, the acetate has all gone into holes. But such a lovely white bandolier, though I must say your green Morocco is even lovelier. Not that it did me much good, that bandolier. Her tears began to flow again. I suppose John told you what I had to suffer, and not a gram of soma to be had. Only a drink of mezcal every now and then, when Pape used to bring it. Pape is a boy I used to know. But it makes you feel so bad afterwards. The mezcal does, and you're sick with the peyote besides. It always made that awful feeling of being ashamed much worse the next day. And I was so ashamed. Just think of it, me, a beta, having a baby, put yourself in my place. The mere suggestion made Lenina shudder. Though it wasn't my fault, I swear, because I still don't know how it happened, seeing that I did all the Malthusian drill, you know, by numbers. 1, 2, 3, 4, always, I swear it. But all the same it happened, and of course there wasn't anything like an abortion center here. Is it still down in Chelsea, by the way? She asked. Lenina nodded. And still flood-lighted on Tuesdays and Fridays? Lenina nodded again. That lovely pink glass tower. Poor Linda lifted her face and with closed eyes, ecstatically contemplated the bright remembered image. And the river at night, she whispered. Great tears oozed slowly out from between her tight-shut eyelids. And flying back in the evening from Stoke Poges. And then a hot bath and vibro vacuum massage. But there. She drew a deep breath, shook her head, opened her eyes again, sniffed once or twice, then blew her nose on her fingers and wiped them on the skirt of her tunic. Oh, I'm so sorry, she said, in response to Lenina's involuntary grimace of disgust. I oughtn't to have done that. I'm sorry. But what are you to do when there aren't any handkerchiefs? I remember how it used to upset me, all that dirt, and nothing being aseptic. I had an awful cut on my head when they first brought me here. You can't imagine what they used to put on it. Filth, just filth. Civilization is sterilization, I used to say to them. And, streptococcus G to Banbury T, to see a fine bathroom in WC, as though they were children. But of course they didn't understand. How should they? And in the end I suppose I got used to it. And anyhow, how can you keep things clean when there isn't hot water laid on? And look at these clothes. This beastly wool isn't like acetate. It lasts and lasts. And you're supposed to mend it if it gets torn. But I'm a beta, the first worked in the fertilizing room. Nobody ever taught me to do anything like that. It wasn't my business. Besides, it never used to be right to mend clothes. Throw them away when they've got holes in them and buy new. The more stitches, the less riches. Isn't that right? Mending's antisocial. But it's all different here. It's like living with lunatics. Everything they do is mad. She looked round, saw John and Bernard had left them, and were walking up and down in the dust and garbage outside the house. But, none the less confidentially lowering her voice, and leaning. While Lenina stiffened and shrank, so close that the blown reek of embryo poison stirred the hair on her cheek. For instance, she hoarsely whispered, "Take the way they have one another here. Mad, I tell you, absolutely mad. Everybody belongs to everyone else, don't they? Don't they? She insisted, tugging at Lenina's sleeve. Lenina nodded her averted head, let out the breath. She had been holding and managed to draw another one, relatively untainted. Well, here, the other went on. Nobody's supposed to belong to more than one person. And if you have people in the ordinary way, the others think you're wicked and antisocial. They hate and despise you. Once a lot of women came and made a scene because their men came to see me. Well, why not? And then they rushed at me. No, it was too awful. I can't tell you about it. Linda covered her face with her hands and shuddered. They're so hateful, the women here. Mad, mad and cruel. And of course they don't know anything about Malthusian drill. Or bottles, or decanting, or anything of that sort. So they're having children all the time, like dogs. It's too revolting. And to think that Ford. And yet John was a great comfort to me. I don't know what I should have done without him. Even though he did get so upset whenever a man, quite as a tiny boy, even, once, but that was when he was bigger. He tried to kill poor Waihusiwa, or was it Pape, just because I used to have them sometimes. Because I never could make him understand that. That was what civilized people ought to do. Being mad's infectious, I believe. Anyhow, John seems to have caught it from the Indians. Because, of course, he was with them a lot. Even though they always were so beastly to him. And wouldn't let him do all the things the other boys did. Which was a good thing in a way. Because it made it easier for me to condition him a little. Though you've no idea how difficult that is. There's so much one doesn't know, it wasn't my business to know. I mean, when a child asks you how a helicopter works or who made the world. Well, what are you to answer if you're a beta? And have always worked in the fertilizing room? What are you to answer? Chapter 8. Outside, in the dust and among the garbage. There were 4 dogs now. Bernard and John were walking slowly up and down. So hard for me to realize, Bernard was saying, to reconstruct. As though we were living on different planets, in different centuries. A mother, and all this dirt, and gods, and old age, and disease. He shook his head. It's almost inconceivable. I shall never understand unless you explain. Explain what? This. He indicated the pueblo. That. And it was the little house outside the village. Everything. All your life. But what is there to say? From the beginning. As far back as you can remember. As far back as I can remember. John frowned. There was a long silence. It was very hot. They had eaten a lot of tortillas and sweet corn. Linda said, "Come and lie down, baby." They lay down together in the big bed. Sing, and Linda sang. Sang, Streptocock G to Banbury tea, and, bye, baby banting, soon. You'll need decanting. Her voice got fainter and fainter. There was a loud noise, and he woke with a start. A man was standing by the bed, enormous, frightening. He was saying something to Linda, and Linda was laughing. She had pulled the blanket up to her chin, but the man pulled it down again. His hair was like 2 black ropes, and round his arm was a lovely silver bracelet with blue stones in it. He liked the bracelet, but all the same. He was frightened. He hid his face against Linda's body. Linda put her hand on him and he felt safer. In those other words he did not understand so well. She said to the man, "Not with John here." The man looked at him, then again at Linda, and said a few words in a soft voice. Linda said, "No." But the man bent over the bed towards him and his face was huge. Terrible. The black ropes of hair touched the blanket. "No," Linda said again, and he felt her hand squeezing him more tightly. "No, no." But the man took hold of one of his arms, and it hurt. He screamed. The man put out his other hand and lifted him up. Linda was still holding him, still saying, "No, no." The man said something short and angry, and suddenly her hands were gone. "Linda, Linda." He kicked and wriggled, but the man carried him across to the door. Opened it, put him down on the floor in the middle of the other room. And went away, shutting the door behind him. He got up, he ran to the door. Standing on tiptoe, he could just reach the big wooden latch. He lifted it and pushed, but the door wouldn't open. "Linda," he shouted. She didn't answer. It was the same with everything else he asked about. Linda never seemed to know. The old men of the pueblo had much more definite answers. The seed of men and all creatures, the seed of the sun and the seed of earth. And the seed of the sky Awanawilona made them all out of the fog of increase. Now the world has 4 wombs. And he laid the seeds in the lowest of the 4 wombs. And gradually the seeds began to grow. One day John calculated later that it must have been soon after his 12th birthday. He came home and found a book that he had never seen before lying on the floor in the bedroom. It was a thick book and looked very old. The binding had been eaten by mice, some of its pages were loose and crumpled. He picked it up, looked at the title page. The book was called The Complete Works of William Shakespeare. Linda was lying on the bed, sipping that horrible stinking mezcal out of a cup. "Pape brought it," she said. Her voice was thick and hoarse like somebody else's voice. It was lying in one of the chests of the Antelope Kiva. It's supposed to have been there for hundreds of years. I expect it's true, because I looked at it. And it seemed to be full of nonsense. Uncivilized. Still, it'll be good enough for you to practice your reading on. She took a last sip, set the cup down on the floor beside the bed, turned over on her side. Hiccuped once or twice and went to sleep. He opened the book at random. Nay, but to live. In the rank sweat of an enseamed bed. Stewed in corruption, honeying and making love. Over the nasty sty. The strange words rolled through his mind, rumbled, like talking thunder, like the drums at the summer dances. If the drums could have spoken like the men singing the corn song, beautiful, beautiful. So that you cried like old Mitsuma, saying magic over his feathers and his carved sticks and his bits of bone and stone, Kiathla silu silakwe silakwe silakwe. Ki silu silu, sithal, but better than Mitsuma's magic. Because it meant more, because it talked to him, talked wonderfully and only half understandably. A terrible beautiful magic, about Linda lying there. Snoring, with the empty cup on the floor beside the bed, about Linda and Pape. He hated Pape more and more. A man can smile and be a villain. Remorseless, treacherous, lecherous, kindless villain. What did the words exactly mean? He only half knew, but their magic was strong and went on rumbling in his head. And somehow it was as though he had never really hated Pape before. Never really hated him because he had never been able to say how much he hated him. But now he had these words like drums and singing and magic. These words and the strange, strange story out of which they were taken. He couldn't make head or tail of it. But it was wonderful, wonderful all the same. They gave him a reason for hating Pape. And they made his hatred more real. They even made Pape himself more real. One day, when he came in from playing, the door of the inner room was open. And he saw them lying together on the bed. Asleep, white Linda and Pape almost black beside her, with one arm under her shoulders. And the other dark hand on her breast, and one of the plaits of his long hair lying across her throat, like a black snake trying to strangle her. Pape's gourd and a cup were standing on the floor near the bed. Linda was snoring. His heart seemed to have disappeared and left a hole. He was empty and cold and rather sick and giddy. He leaned against the wall to steady himself. Remorseless, treacherous, lecherous. Like drums, like the men singing for the corn, like magic. The words repeated and repeated themselves in his head. From being cold he was suddenly hot. His cheeks burned with the rush of blood. The room swam and darkened before his eyes. He ground his teeth. "I'll kill him, I'll kill him, I'll kill him," he kept saying. And suddenly there were more words. When he is drunk asleep, or in his rage, or in the incestuous pleasure of his bed. The magic was on his side. The magic explained and gave orders. He stepped back into the outer room. When he is drunk asleep. The knife for the meat was lying on the floor near the fireplace. He picked it up and tiptoed to the door again. When he is drunk asleep, drunk asleep. He ran across the room and stabbed. Oh, the blood, stabbed again, as Pape heaved out of his sleep, lifted his hand to stab once more. But found his wrist caught, held and, twisted. He couldn't move, he was trapped, and there were Pape's small black eyes, very close, staring into his own. He looked away. There were 2 cuts on Pape's left shoulder. "Oh, look at the blood." Linda was crying. Look at the blood. She had never been able to bear the sight of blood. Pape lifted his other hand, to strike him, he thought. He stiffened to receive the blow. But the hand only took him under the chin. And turned his face, so that he had to look again into Pape's eyes. For a long time, for hours and hours. And suddenly, he couldn't help it, he began to cry. Pape burst out laughing. "Go," he said, in the other Indian words. "Go, my brave Ahayuta." He ran out into the other room to hide his tears. "You are 15, said old Mitsuma, in the Indian words. "Now I may teach you to work the clay." Squatting by the river, they worked together. "First of all," said Mitsuma, taking a lump of the wetted clay between his hands, "we make a little moon." The old man squeezed the lump into a disc. Then bent up the edges. The moon became a shallow cup. Slowly and unskillfully he imitated the old man's delicate gestures. A moon, a cup, and now a snake. Mitsuma rolled out another piece of clay into a long flexible cylinder, hooped it into a circle and pressed it on to the rim of the cup. Then another snake, and another, and another. Round by round, Mitsuma built up the sides of the pot. It was narrow, it bulged, it narrowed again towards the neck. Mitsuma squeezed and patted, stroked and scraped, and there at last it stood, in shape the familiar water pot of Malpais, but creamy white instead of black, and still soft to the touch. The crooked parody of Mitsuma's, his own, stood beside it. Looking at the two pots, he had to laugh. "But the next one will be better," he said, and began to moisten another piece of clay. To fashion, to give form, to feel his fingers gaining in skill and power. This gave him an extraordinary pleasure. A, B, C, vitamin D, he sang to himself as he worked. The fat's in the liver, the cod's in the sea. And Mitsuma also sang a song about killing a bear. They worked all day and all day. He was filled with an intense, absorbing happiness. "Next winter," said old Mitsuma, "I will teach you to make the bow." He stood for a long time outside the house, and at last the ceremonies within were finished. The door opened, they came out. Kothlu came first, his right hand outstretched and tightly closed, as though over some precious jewel. Her clenched hand similarly outstretched. Kiyakame followed. They walked in silence, and in silence, behind them, came the brothers and sisters and cousins and all the troop of old people. They walked out of the pueblo, across the mesa. At the edge of the cliff they halted, facing the early morning sun. Kothlu opened his hand. A pinch of cornmeal lay white on the palm. He breathed on it, murmured a few words. Then threw it, a handful of white dust, towards the sun. Kiyakame did the same. Then Kiyakame's father stepped forward, and holding up a feathered prayer stick, made a long prayer. Then threw the stick after the cornmeal. "It is finished," said old Mitsuma in a loud voice. "They are married." "Well," said Linda, as they turned away, "all I can say is, it does seem a lot of fuss to make about so little. In civilized countries, when a boy wants to have a girl, he just—" "But where are you going, John?" He paid no attention to her calling, but ran on, away, away, anywhere to be by himself. "It is finished." Old Mitsuma's words repeated themselves in his mind. Finished, finished. In silence and from a long way off. But violently, desperately, hopelessly, he had loved Kiyakame. And now it was finished. He was 16, at the full moon, in the antelope. Kiva, secrets would be told, secrets would be done and born. They would go down, boys, into the Kiva and come out again, men. The boys were all afraid and at the same time impatient. And at last it was the day. The sun went down, the moon rose. He went with the others. Men were standing, dark, at the entrance to the Kiva. The ladder went down into the red-lighted depths. Already the leading boys had begun to climb down. Suddenly one of the men stepped forward, caught him by the arm, and pulled him out of the ranks. He broke free and dodged back into his place among the others. This time the man struck him, pulled his hair. "Not for you, white hair. Not for the son of the she-dog," said one of the other men. The boys laughed. "Go." And as he still hovered on the fringes of the group, "Go," the men shouted again. One of them bent down, took a stone, threw it. "Go, go, go." There was a shower of stones. Bleeding, he ran away into the darkness. From the red-lit Kiva came the noise of singing. The last of the boys had climbed down the ladder. He was all alone, outside the pueblo, on the bare plain of the mesa. The rock was like bleached bones in the moonlight. Down in the valley, the coyotes were howling at the moon. The bruises hurt him, the cuts were still bleeding, but it was not for pain that he sobbed. It was because he was all alone. Because he had been driven out, alone, into this skeleton world of rocks and moonlight. At the edge of the precipice he sat down. The moon was behind him. He looked down into the black shadow of the mesa, into the black shadow of death. He had only to take one step, one little jump. He held out his right hand in the moonlight. From the cut on his wrist the blood was still oozing. Every few seconds a drop fell, dark, almost colorless in the dead light. Drop, drop, drop. Tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow. He had discovered time and death and God. Alone, always alone, the young man was saying. The words awoke a plaintive echo in Bernard's mind. Alone, alone. So am I, he said, on a gush of confidingness. Terribly alone. Are you? John looked surprised. I thought that in the other place. I mean, Linda always said that nobody was ever alone there. Bernard blushed uncomfortably. You see, he said, mumbling and with averted eyes. I'm rather different from most people, I suppose. If one happens to be decanted different. Yes, that's just it. The young man nodded. If one's different, one's bound to be lonely. They're beastly to one. Do you know, they shut me out of absolutely everything? When the other boys were sent out to spend the night on the mountains, you know, when you have to dream which your sacred animal is, they wouldn't let me go with the others. They wouldn't tell me any of the secrets. I did it by myself, though, he added. Didn't eat anything for 5 days. And then went out one night alone into those mountains there. He pointed. Patronizingly, Bernard smiled. And did you dream of anything? He asked. The other nodded. But I mustn't tell you what. He was silent for a little, then, in a low voice, once. He went on, I did something that none of the others did. I stood against a rock in the middle of the day, in summer, with my arms out, like Jesus on the cross. What on earth for? I wanted to know what it was like being crucified. Hanging there in the sun. But why? Why? Well, he hesitated. Because I felt I ought to. If Jesus could stand it. And then, if one has done something wrong. Besides, I was unhappy. That was another reason. It seems a funny way of curing your unhappiness, said Bernard. But on second thoughts he decided that there was, after all, some sense in it. Better than taking soma. I fainted after a time, said the young man. Fell down on my face. Do you see the mark where I cut myself? He lifted the thick yellow hair from his forehead. The scar showed, pale and puckered, on his right temple. Bernard looked, and then quickly, with a little shudder, averted his eyes. His conditioning had made him not so much pitiful as profoundly squeamish. The mere suggestion of illness or wounds was to him not only horrifying, but even repulsive and rather disgusting. Like dirt, or deformity, or old age. Hastily he changed the subject. I wonder if you'd like to come back to London with us? He asked, making the first move in a campaign whose strategy he had been secretly elaborating ever since, in the little house. He had realized who the father of this young savage must be. Would you like that? The young man's face lit up. Do you really mean it? Of course, if I can get permission, that is. Linda too? Well, he hesitated doubtfully. That revolting creature. No, it was impossible. Unless, it suddenly occurred to Bernard that her very revoltingness might prove an enormous asset. But of course, he cried, making up for his first hesitations with an excess of noisy cordiality. The young man drew a deep breath. To think it should be coming true, what I've dreamt of all my life. Do you remember what Miranda says? Who's Miranda? But the young man had evidently not heard the question. Oh wonder, he was saying, and his eyes shone, his face was brightly flushed. How many goodly creatures are there here? How beauteous mankind is. The flush suddenly deepened. He was thinking of Lenina, of an angel in bottle green viscose, lustrous with youth and skin food, plump, benevolently smiling. His voice faltered. Oh brave new world, he began, then suddenly interrupted himself. The blood had left his cheeks. He was as pale as paper. Are you married to her? He asked. Am I what? Married. You know, forever. They say, forever, in the Indian words it can't be broken. Ford, no. Bernard couldn't help laughing. John also laughed, but for another reason, laughed for pure joy. Oh brave new world, he repeated. Oh brave new world that has such people in it. Let's start at once. You have a most peculiar way of talking sometimes, said Bernard, staring at the young man in perplexed astonishment. And, anyhow, hadn't you better wait till you actually see the new world? Chapter 9. Lenina felt herself entitled, after this day of queerness and horror, to a complete and absolute holiday. As soon as they got back to the rest house, she swallowed 6 half-gram tablets of soma, lay down on her bed, and within 10 minutes had embarked for lunar eternity. It would be 18 hours at the least before she was in time again. Bernard meanwhile lay pensive and wide-eyed in the dark. It was long after midnight before he fell asleep. Long after midnight, but his insomnia had not been fruitless. He had a plan. Punctually, on the following morning, at 10 o'clock, the green-uniformed octoroon stepped out of his helicopter. Bernard was waiting for him among the agaves. "Miss Crown's gone on soma holiday," he explained. "Can hardly be back before 5. Which leaves us 7 hours. He could fly to Santa Fe, do all the business he had to do, and be in Malpais again long before she woke up. She'll be quite safe here by herself?" "Safe as helicopters," the octoroon assured him. They climbed into the machine and started off at once. At 10:34 they landed on the roof of the Santa Fe post office. At 10:37 Bernard had got through to the World Controller's office in Whitehall. At 10:39 he was speaking to his Fordship's 4th personal secretary. At 10:44 he was repeating his story to the first secretary. And at 10:47.5, it was the deep, resonant voice of Mustafa Mond himself that sounded in his ears. "I ventured to think," stammered Bernard, "that your Fordship might find the matter of sufficient scientific interest." "Yes, I do find it of sufficient scientific interest," said the deep voice. "Bring these 2 individuals back to London with you. Your Fordship is aware that I shall need a special permit." "The necessary orders," said Mustafa Mond, "are being sent to the warden of the reservation at this moment. You will proceed at once to the warden's office." "Good morning, Mr. Marks." There was silence. Bernard hung up the receiver and hurried up to the roof. "Warden's office," he said to the gamma-green octoroon. At 10:54 Bernard was shaking hands with the warden. "Delighted, Mr. Marks, delighted." His boom was deferential. "We have just received special orders." "I know," said Bernard, interrupting him. "I was talking to his Fordship on the phone a moment ago." His bored tone implied that he was in the habit of talking to his Fordship every day of the week. He dropped into a chair. "If you'll kindly take all the necessary steps as soon as possible." "As soon as possible," he emphatically repeated. He was thoroughly enjoying himself. At 11:03 he had all the necessary papers in his pocket. "So long," he said patronizingly to the warden, who had accompanied him as far as the lift gates. "So long." He walked across to the hotel, had a bath, a vibrovac massage, and an electrolytic shave, listened in to the morning's news, looked in for half an hour on the televisor, ate a leisured luncheon, and at 2:30 flew back with the octoroon to Malpais. The young man stood outside the rest house. "Bernard," he called. "Bernard." There was no answer. Noiseless on his deerskin moccasins, he ran up the steps and tried the door. The door was locked. They were gone. Gone. It was the most terrible thing that had ever happened to him. She had asked him to come and see them, and now they were gone. He sat down on the steps and cried. Half an hour later it occurred to him to look through the window. The first thing he saw was a green suitcase, with the initials LC painted on the lid. Joy flared up like fire within him. He picked up a stone. The smashed glass tinkled on the floor. A moment later he was inside the room. He opened the green suitcase and all at once he was breathing Lenina's perfume, filling his lungs with her essential being. His heart beat wildly for a moment. He was almost faint. Then, bending over the precious box, he touched, he lifted into the light, he examined. The zippers on Lenina's spare pair of viscose velveteen shorts were at first a puzzle. Then, solved, a delight. Zip, and then zip, and then zip. He was enchanted. Her green slippers were the most beautiful things he had ever seen. He unfolded a pair of Zipitsa mikniks, blushed, put them hastily away again, but kissed a perfumed acetate handkerchief and wound a scarf round his neck. Opening a box, he spilt a cloud of scented powder. His hands were floury with the stuff. He wiped them on his chest, on his shoulders, on his bare arms. Delicious perfume. He shut his eyes. He rubbed his cheek against his own powdered arm. Touch of smooth skin against his face. Scent in his nostrils of musky dust, her real presence. Lenina, he whispered. Lenina. A noise made him start, made him guiltily turn. He crammed up his thieveries into the suitcase and shut the lid, then listened again, looked. Not a sign of life, not a sound. And yet he had certainly heard something like a sigh, something like the creak of a board. He tiptoed to the door and, cautiously opening it, found himself looking onto a broad landing. On the opposite side of the landing was another door, ajar. He stepped out, pushed, peeped. There, on a low bed, the sheet flung back, dressed in a pair of pink one-piece zip-pajamas, lay Lenina, fast asleep and so beautiful in the midst of her curls. So touchingly childish with her pink toes and her grave sleeping face, so trustful in the helplessness of her limp hands and melted limbs that the tears came to his eyes. With an infinity of quite unnecessary precautions, for nothing short of a pistol shot could have called Lenina back from her Soma holiday before the appointed time. He entered the room, he knelt on the floor beside the bed. He gazed, he clasped his hands, his lips moved. Her eyes, he murmured. Her eyes, her hair, her cheek, her gait, her voice. Handlest in thy discourse, oh, that her hand, in whose comparison all whites are ink, writing their own reproach to whose soft seizure the signet's down is harsh. A fly buzzed round her, he waved it away. Flies, he remembered, on the white wonder of dear Juliet's hand, may seize and steal a mortal blessing from her lips, who, even in pure and vestal modesty, still blush, as thinking their own kisses sin. Very slowly, with the hesitating gesture of one who reaches forward to stroke a shy and possibly rather dangerous bird, he put out his hand. It hung there trembling, within an inch of those limp fingers, on the verge of contact. Did he dare? Dare to profane with his unworthiest hand that? No, he didn't. The bird was too dangerous. His hand dropped back. How beautiful she was. How beautiful. Then suddenly he found himself reflecting that he had only to take hold of the zipper at her neck and give one long, strong pull. He shut his eyes, he shook his head with the gesture of a dog, shaking its ears as it emerges from the water. Detestable thought. He was ashamed of himself. Pure and vestal modesty. There was a humming in the air. Another fly trying to steal immortal blessings? A wasp? He looked, saw nothing. The humming grew louder and louder. Localized itself as being outside the shuttered windows. The plane. In a panic, he scrambled to his feet and ran into the other room, vaulted through the open window, and hurrying along the path between the tall agaves was in time to receive Bernard Marx as he climbed out of the helicopter. Chapter 10. The hands of all the 4,000 electric clocks in all. The Bloomsbury Centre's 4,000 rooms marked 27 minutes past 2. This hive of industry, as the director was fond of calling it, was in the full buzz of work. Everyone was busy, everything in ordered motion. Under the microscopes, their long tails furiously lashing, spermatozoa were burrowing head first into eggs and, fertilized. The eggs were expanding, dividing, or if Bakanovskified, budding and breaking up into whole populations of separate embryos. From the social predestination room the escalators went rumbling down into the basement. And there, in the crimson darkness, stewingly warm on their cushion of peritoneum and gorged with blood surrogate and hormones, the fetuses grew and grew or, poisoned, languished into a stunted epsilonhood. With a faint hum and rattle the moving racks crawled imperceptibly through the weeks and the recapitulated eons to where, in the decanting room, the newly unbottled babes uttered their first yell of horror and amazement. The dynamos purred in the sub-basement, the lifts rushed up and down. On all the 11 floors of nurseries it was feeding time. From 1,800 bottles 1,800 carefully labeled infants were simultaneously sucking down their pint of pasteurized external secretion. Above them, in 10 successive layers of dormitory, the little boys and girls who were still young enough to need an afternoon sleep were as busy as everyone else. Though they did not know it, listening unconsciously to hypnopedic lessons in hygiene and sociability, in class consciousness. And the toddlers love life. Above these again were the playrooms where, the weather having turned to rain, 900 older children were amusing themselves with bricks and clay modeling, hunt the zipper, and erotic play. Buzz, buzz. The hive was humming, busily, joyfully. Blithe was the singing of the young girls over their test tubes. The predestinators whistled as they worked, and in the decanting room, what glorious jokes were cracked above the empty bottles. But the director's face, as he entered the fertilizing room with Henry Foster, was grave, wooden with severity. A public example, he was saying. In this room, because it contains more high caste workers than any other in the center. I have told him to meet me here at 2:30. He does his work very well, put in Henry, with hypocritical generosity. I know. But that's all the more reason for severity. His intellectual eminence carries with it corresponding moral responsibilities. The greater a man's talents, the greater his power to lead astray. It is better that one should suffer than that many should be corrupted. Consider the matter dispassionately, Mr. Foster. And you will see that no offense is so heinous as unorthodoxy of behavior. Murder kills only the individual, and, after all, what is an individual? With a sweeping gesture, he indicated the rows of microscopes, the test tubes, the incubators. We can make a new one with the greatest ease, as many as we like. Unorthodoxy threatens more than the life of a mere individual. It strikes at society itself. Yes, at society itself, he repeated. Ah, but here he comes. Bernard had entered the room, and was advancing between the rows of fertilizers towards them. A veneer of jaunty self-confidence thinly concealed his nervousness. The voice in which he said, "Good morning, Director," was absurdly too loud, that in which, correcting his mistake, he said, "You asked me to come and speak to you here," ridiculously soft, a squeak. "Yes, Mr. Marks," said the director portentously. "I did ask you to come to me here. You returned from your holiday last night, I understand." "Yes," Bernard answered. "Yes, repeated the director, lingering, a serpent, on the S. Then, suddenly raising his voice, "Ladies and gentlemen," he trumpeted, "ladies and gentlemen." The singing of the girls over their test tubes, the preoccupied whistling of the microscopists, suddenly ceased. There was a profound silence. Everyone looked round. "Ladies and gentlemen," the director repeated once more, "excuse me for thus interrupting your labors. A painful duty constrains me. The security and stability of society are in danger. Yes, in danger, ladies and gentlemen. This man," he pointed accusingly at Bernard, "this man who stands before you here, this Alpha Plus to whom so much has been given, and from whom, in consequence, so much must be expected, this colleague of yours, or should I anticipate and say this ex-colleague, has grossly betrayed the trust imposed in him. By his heretical views on sport and soma, by the scandalous unorthodoxy of his sex life, by his refusal to obey the teachings of our Ford and behave out of office hours like a babe in a bottle." Here the director made the sign of the T. "He has proved himself an enemy of society, a subverter, ladies and gentlemen, of all order and stability, a conspirator against civilization itself. For this reason I propose to dismiss him with ignominy from the post he has held in this center. I propose forthwith to apply for his transference to a sub-center of the lowest order, and, that his punishment may serve the best interest of society, as far as possible, removed from any important center of population. In Iceland he will have small opportunity to lead others astray by his unfordly example." The director paused, then, folding his arms, he turned impressively to Bernard Marks. He said, "Can you show any reason why I should not now execute the judgment passed upon you?" "Yes, I can," Bernard answered in a very loud voice. Somewhat taken aback, but still majestically. "Then show it," said the director. "Certainly. But it's in the passage." "One moment." Bernard hurried to the door and threw it open. "Come in," he commanded, and the reason came in and showed itself. There was a gasp, a murmur of astonishment and horror. A young girl screamed, standing on a chair to get a better view. Someone upset 2 test tubes full of spermatozoa. Bloated, sagging, and among those firm youthful bodies, those undistorted faces, a strange and terrifying monster of middle-agedness, Linda advanced into the room, coquettishly smiling her broken and discolored smile, and rolling, as she walked, with what was meant to be a voluptuous undulation, her enormous haunches. Bernard walked beside her. "There he is," he said, pointing at the director. "Did you think I didn't recognize him?" Linda asked indignantly. Then, turning to the director, "Of course I knew you, Tomakin. I should have known you anywhere, among 1,000. But perhaps you've forgotten me. Don't you remember? Don't you remember, Tomakin? You're Linda." She stood looking at him, her head on one side, still smiling. but with a smile that became progressively, in face of the director's expression of petrified disgust, less and less self-confident, that wavered and finally went out. "Don't you remember, Tomakin?" she repeated in a voice that trembled. Her eyes were anxious, agonized. The blotched and sagging face twitched grotesquely into the grimace of extreme grief. "Tomakin." She held out her arms. Someone began to titter. "What's the meaning," began the director, "of this monstrous Tomakin?" She ran forward, her blanket trailing behind her, threw her arms round his neck, hid her face on his chest. A howl of laughter went up irrepressibly. "This monstrous practical joke," the director shouted. Red in the face, he tried to disengage himself from her embrace. Desperately she clung. "But I'm Linda, I'm Linda." The laughter drowned her voice. "You made me have a baby," she screamed above the uproar. There was a sudden and appalling hush. Eyes floated uncomfortably, not knowing where to look. The director went suddenly pale, stopped struggling and stood, his hands on her wrists, staring down at her, horrified. "Yes, a baby, and I was its mother." She flung the obscenity like a challenge into the outraged silence. Then, suddenly breaking away from him, ashamed, covered her face with her hands, sobbing. "It wasn't my fault, Tomakin. Because I always did my drill, didn't I? Didn't I? Always. I don't know how. If you knew how awful, Tomakin. But he was a comfort to me, all the same." Turning towards the door, "John," she called. "John." He came in at once, paused for a moment just inside the door, looked round, then soft on his moccasined feet strode quickly across the room, fell on his knees in front of the director, and said in a clear voice, "My father." The word for father was not so much obscene as, with its connotation of something at one remove from the loathsomeness and moral obliquity of childbearing, merely gross, a scatological rather than a pornographic impropriety. The comically smutty word relieved what had become a quite intolerable tension. Laughter broke out, enormous, almost hysterical, peal after peal, as though it would never stop. "My father," and it was the director. "My father. Oh, Ford, oh Ford." That was really too good. The whooping and the roaring renewed themselves. Faces seemed on the point of disintegration, tears were streaming. 6 more test tubes of spermatozoa were upset. "My father." Pale, wild-eyed, the director glared about him in an agony of bewildered humiliation. "My father." The laughter, which had shown signs of dying away, broke out again more loudly than ever. He put his hands over his ears and rushed out of the room. Chapter 11. After the scene in the fertilizing room, all upper-caste London was wild to see this delicious creature, who had fallen on his knees before the director of hatcheries and conditioning, or rather the ex-director, for the poor man had resigned immediately afterwards and never set foot inside the center again, had flopped down and called him. The joke was almost too good to be true. "My father." Linda, on the contrary, cut no ice. Nobody had the smallest desire to see Linda. To say one was a mother, that was past a joke, it was an obscenity. Moreover, she wasn't a real savage, had been hatched out of a bottle and conditioned like anyone else, so couldn't have really quaint ideas. Finally, and this was by far the strongest reason for people's not wanting to see poor Linda, there was her appearance. Fat, having lost her youth. With bad teeth, and a blotched complexion, and that figure Ford. You simply couldn't look at her without feeling sick, yes, positively sick. So the best people were quite determined not to see Linda. And Linda, for her part, had no desire to see them. The return to civilization was for her. The return to Soma was the possibility of lying in bed and taking holiday after holiday, without ever having to come back to a headache, or a fit of vomiting, without ever being made to feel as you always felt after payodal. As though you'd done something so shamefully antisocial that you could never hold up your head again. Soma played none of these unpleasant tricks. The holiday it gave was perfect and, if the morning after was disagreeable, it was so, not intrinsically, but only by comparison with the joys of the holiday. The remedy was to make the holiday continuous. Greedily she clamored for ever larger, ever more frequent doses. Dr. Shaw at first demurred, then let her have what she wanted. She took as much as 20 grams a day, which will finish her off in a month or two, the doctor confided to Bernard. One day the respiratory center will be paralyzed. No more breathing. Finished. And a good thing too. If we could rejuvenate, of course it would be different. But we can't. Surprisingly, as everyone thought for on Soma holiday, Linda was most conveniently out of the way. John raised objections. But aren't you shortening her life by giving her so much? In one sense, yes, Dr. Shaw admitted. But in another we're actually lengthening it. The young man stared, uncomprehending. Soma may make you lose a few years in time, the doctor went on. But think of the enormous, immeasurable durations it can give you out of time. Every Soma holiday is a bit of what our ancestors used to call eternity. John began to understand. Eternity was in our lips and eyes, he murmured. Nothing. Of course, Dr. Shaw went on, you can't allow people to go popping off into eternity if they've got any serious work to do. But as she hasn't got any serious work. All the same, John persisted, I don't believe it's right. The doctor shrugged his shoulders. Well, of course, if you prefer to have her screaming mad all the time. In the end John was forced to give in. Linda got her Soma. Thenceforward she remained in her little room on the 37th floor of Bernard's apartment house. In bed, with the radio and television always on. And the patchouli tap just dripping. And the Soma tablets within reach of her hand, there she remained and yet wasn't there at all. Was all the time away, infinitely far away, on holiday in some other world. Where the music of the radio was a labyrinth of sonorous colors, a sliding, palpitating labyrinth that led by what beautifully inevitable windings to a bright center of absolute conviction. Where the dancing images of the television box were the performers in some indescribably delicious all-singing feelie, where the dripping patchouli was more than scent, was the sun, was a million saxophones, was Pape making love, only much more so, incomparably more, and without end. No, we can't rejuvenate. But I'm very glad, Dr. Shaw had concluded, to have had this opportunity. To see an example of senility in a human being. Thank you so much for calling me in. He shook Bernard warmly by the hand. It was John, then, they were all after. And as it was only through Bernard, his accredited guardian, that John could be seen, Bernard now found himself, for the first time in his life, treated not merely normally, but as a person of outstanding importance. There was no more talk of the alcohol in his blood surrogate, no gibs at his personal appearance. Henry Foster went out of his way to be friendly. Benito Hoover made him a present of 6 packets of sex hormone chewing gum. The assistant predestinator came and cadged almost abjectly for an invitation to one of Bernard's evening parties. As for the women, Bernard had only to hint at the possibility of an invitation, and he could have whichever of them he liked. Bernard's asked me to meet the Savage next Wednesday, Fanny announced triumphantly. I'm so glad, said Lenina. And now you must admit that you were wrong about Bernard. Don't you think he's really rather sweet? Fanny nodded. And I must say, she said, I was quite agreeably surprised. The chief bottler, the director of predestination, 3 deputy assistant fertilizer generals, the professor of Feelies in the College of Emotional Engineering, the dean of the Westminster Community Singery, the supervisor of Bakanovskification, the list of Bernard's notabilities was interminable. And I had 6 girls last week, he confided to Helmholtz Watson. 1 on Monday, 2 on Tuesday, 2 more on Friday, and 1 on Saturday. And if I'd had the time or the inclination, there were at least a dozen more who were only too anxious. Helmholtz listened to his boastings in a silence, so gloomily disapproving that Bernard was offended. You're envious, he said. Helmholtz shook his head. I'm rather sad, that's all, he answered. Bernard went off in a huff. Never, he told himself, never would he speak to Helmholtz again. The days passed. Success went fizzily to Bernard's head, and in the process completely reconciled him, as any good intoxicant should do, to a world which, up till then, he had found very unsatisfactory. Insofar as it recognized him as important, the order of things was good. But, reconciled by his success, he yet refused to forego the privilege of criticizing this order. For the act of criticizing heightened his sense of importance, made him feel larger. Moreover, he did genuinely believe that there were things to criticize. At the same time, he genuinely liked being a success and having all the girls he wanted, before those who now, for the sake of the Savage, paid their court to him. Bernard would parade a carping unorthodoxy. He was politely listened to, but behind his back people shook their heads. That young man will come to a bad end, they said, prophesying the more confidently in that they themselves would in due course personally see to it that the end was bad. He won't find another savage to help him out a second time, they said. Meanwhile, however, there was the first savage. They were polite. And because they were polite, Bernard felt positively gigantic. Gigantic and at the same time light with elation, lighter than air. Lighter than air, said Bernard, pointing upwards. Like a pearl in the sky, high, high above them. The weather department's captive balloon shone rosily in the sunshine. The said savage, so ran Bernard's instructions, to be shown civilized life in all its aspects. He was being shown a bird's eye view of it at present, a bird's eye view from the platform of the Charing T Tower. The station master and the resident meteorologist were acting as guides, but it was Bernard who did most of the talking. Intoxicated, he was behaving as though, at the very least, he were a visiting world controller. Lighter than air. The Bombay green rocket dropped out of the sky. The passengers alighted. 8 identical Dravidian twins in khaki looked out of the 8 portholes of the cabin. The steward's 1,250 kilometers an hour, said the station master impressively. What do you think of that, Mr. Savage? John thought it very nice. Still, he said, Ariel could put a girdle round the earth in 40 minutes. The savage, wrote Bernard in his report to Mustafa Mond, shows surprisingly little astonishment at, or awe of, civilized inventions. This is partly due, no doubt, to the fact that he has heard them talked about by the woman Linda, his M. Mustafa Mond frowned. Does the fool think I'm too squeamish to see the word written out at full length? Partly on his interest being focused on what he calls the soul, which he persists as regarding as an entity independent of the physical environment, whereas, as I tried to point out to him, the controller skipped the next sentences, and was just about to turn the page in search of something more interestingly concrete, when his eye was caught by a series of quite extraordinary phrases. Though I must admit, he read, that I agree with the savage in finding civilized infantility too easy or, as he puts it, not expensive enough, and I would like to take this opportunity of drawing your Fordship's attention to. Mustafa Mond's anger gave place almost at once to mirth. The idea of this creature solemnly lecturing him, about the social order was really too grotesque. The man must have gone mad. I ought to give him a lesson, he said to himself, then threw back his head and laughed aloud. For the moment, at any rate, the lesson would not be given. It was a small factory of lighting sets for helicopters, a branch of the Electrical Equipment Corporation. They were met on the roof itself for that circular letter of recommendation from the controller was magical in its effects by the chief technician and the human element manager. They walked downstairs into the factory. Each process, explained the human element manager, is carried out, so far as possible, by a single Bokanovsky group. And, in effect, 83 almost noseless black brachycephalic deltas were cold pressing. The 56 4 spindle chucking and turning machines were being manipulated by 56 aquiline and ginger gammas. 107 heat-conditioned epsilon Senegalese were working in the foundry. 33 delta females, long-headed, sandy, with narrow pelvises, and all within 20 millimeters of 1 meter 69 centimeters tall, were cutting screws. In the assembling room, the dynamos were being put together by 2 sets of gamma plus dwarfs. The 2 low work tables faced one another. Between them crawled the conveyor with its load of separate parts. 47 blonde heads were confronted by 47 brown ones. 47 snubs by 47 hooks. 47 receding by 47 prognathous chins. The completed mechanisms were inspected by 18 identical curly auburn girls in gamma green, packed in crates by 34 short-legged, left-handed male delta minuses, and loaded into the waiting trucks and lorries by 63 blue-eyed, flaxen and freckled epsilon semi-morons. Oh brave new world! By some malice of his memory the savage found himself repeating Miranda's words. Oh brave new world that has such people in it. And I assure you, the human element manager concluded, as they left the factory, we hardly ever have any trouble with our workers. We always find. But the savage had suddenly broken away from his companions, and was violently retching, behind a clump of laurels, as though the solid earth had been a helicopter in an air pocket. The savage, wrote Bernard, refuses to take Soma, and seems much distressed because the woman Linda, his remains permanently on holiday. It is worthy of note that, in spite of his senility and the extreme repulsiveness of her appearance, the savage frequently goes to see her and appears to be much attached to her. An interesting example of the way in which early conditioning can be made to modify, and even run counter to natural impulses in this case. The impulse to recoil from an unpleasant object. At Eton they alighted on the roof of Upper School. On the opposite side of School Yard, the 52 stories of Lupton's Tower gleamed white in the sunshine. College on their left and, on their right, the school community Singery reared their venerable piles of ferro-concrete and Vita glass. In the center of the quadrangle stood the quaint old chrome steel statue of our Ford. Dr. Gaffney, the provost, and Miss Keat, the head mistress, received them as they stepped out of the plane. "Do you have many twins here?" the savage asked rather apprehensively, as they set out on their tour of inspection. "Oh no," the provost answered. "Eton is reserved exclusively for upper caste boys and girls. One egg, one adult. It makes education more difficult, of course. But as they'll be called upon to take responsibilities and deal with unexpected emergencies, it can't be helped." He sighed. Bernard, meanwhile, had taken a strong fancy to Miss Keat. "If you're free any Monday, Wednesday, or Friday evening," he was saying, jerking his thumb towards the savage. "He's curious, you know," Bernard added. Quaint. Miss Keat smiled, and her smile was really charming. He thought said thank you would be delighted to come to one of his parties. The provost opened a door. 5 minutes in that Alpha Double Plus classroom left John a trifle bewildered. "What is elementary relativity?" he whispered to Bernard. Bernard tried to explain, then thought better of it, and suggested that they should go to some other classroom. From behind a door in the corridor leading to the Beta-Geography room, a ringing soprano voice called, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then, with a weary impatience, "As you were." "Malthusian drill," explained the head mistress. "Most of our girls are free martins, of course. I'm a free martin myself." She smiled at Bernard. "But we have about 800 unsterilized ones who need constant drilling." In the Beta-Geography room John learnt that a savage reservation is a place which, owing to unfavorable climatic or geological conditions, or poverty of natural resources, has not been worth the expense of civilizing. A click the room was darkened and suddenly, on the screen above the master's head, there were the penitentes of a coma prostrating themselves before Our Lady, and wailing, as John had heard them wail, confessing their sins before Jesus on the cross, before the eagle image of Pukong. The young Etonians fairly shouted with laughter. Still wailing, the penitentes rose to their feet, stripped off their upper garments and, with knotted whips, began to beat themselves, blow after blow. Redoubled, the laughter drowned even the amplified record of their groans. "But why do they laugh?" asked the savage in a pained bewilderment. "Why?" The provost turned towards him a still broadly grinning face. "Why? But because it's so extraordinarily funny." In the cinematographic twilight, Bernard risked a gesture which, in the past, even total darkness would hardly have emboldened him to make. Strong in his new importance, he put his arm round the head mistress's waist. It yielded, willowily. He was just about to snatch a kiss or two, and perhaps a gentle pinch, when the shutters clicked open again. "Perhaps we had better go on," said Miss Keat, and moved towards the door. "And this," said the provost a moment later, "is the hypnopedic control room." Hundreds of synthetic music boxes, one for each dormitory, stood ranged in shelves round 3 sides of the room. Pigeonholed on the 4th were the paper soundtrack rolls on which the various hypnopedic lessons were printed. "You slip the roll in here," explained Bernard, interrupting Dr. Gaffney. "Press down this switch." "No, that one," corrected the provost, annoyed. "That one, then." The roll unwinds. The selenium cells transform the light impulses into sound waves and there you are, Dr. Gaffney concluded. "Do they read Shakespeare?" asked the savage as they walked, on their way to the biochemical laboratories, past the school library. "Certainly not," said the head mistress, blushing. "Our library," said Dr. Gaffney, "contains only books of reference. If our young people need distraction, they can get it at the Feelies. We don't encourage them to indulge in any solitary amusements." 5 busloads of boys and girls, singing or in a silent embracement, rolled past them over the vitrified highway. Just returned, explained Dr. Gaffney. While Bernard, whispering, made an appointment with the head mistress for that very evening, from the Slough crematorium. Death conditioning begins at 18 months. Every tot spends 2 mornings a week in a hospital for the dying. All the best toys are kept there, and they get chocolate cream on death days. They learn to take dying as a matter of course. Like any other physiological process, put in the head mistress professionally. 8 o'clock at the Savoy. It was all arranged. On their way back to London, they stopped at the Television Corporation's factory at Brentford. "Do you mind waiting here a moment while I go and telephone?" asked Bernard. The savage waited and watched. The main day shift was just going off duty. Crowds of lower caste workers were queued up in front of the monorail station. 700 or 800 Gamma, Delta and Epsilon men and women, with not more than a dozen faces and statures between them. To each of them, with his or her ticket, the booking clerk pushed over a little cardboard pillbox. The long caterpillar of men and women moved slowly forward. "What's in those?" remembering the Merchant of Venice. "Those caskets?" the savage inquired when Bernard had rejoined him. "The day's soma ration," Bernard answered, rather indistinctly. For he was masticating a piece of Benito Hoover's chewing gum. "They get it after their work's over. 4 half-gram tablets. 6 on Saturdays." He took John's arm affectionately and they walked back towards the helicopter. Lenina came singing into the changing room. "You seem very pleased with yourself," said Fanny. "I am pleased," she answered. Zip. "Bernard rang up half an hour ago." Zip, zip. She stepped out of her shorts. "He has an unexpected engagement." Zip. "Asked me if I'd take the savage to the Feelies this evening." "I must fly." She hurried away towards the bathroom. "She's a lucky girl," Fanny said to herself as she watched Lenina go. There was no envy in the comment. Good-natured Fanny was merely stating a fact. Lenina was lucky in having shared with Bernard a generous portion of the savage's immense celebrity, lucky in reflecting from her insignificant person the moment's supremely fashionable glory. Had not the secretary of the Young Women's Fortean Association asked her to give a lecture about her experiences? Had she not been invited to the annual dinner of the Aphroditeum Club? Had she not already appeared in the Feelytone news, visibly, audibly and tactually appeared to countless millions all over the planet? Hardly less flattering had been the attentions paid her by conspicuous individuals. The resident world controller's second secretary had asked her to dinner and breakfast. She had spent one weekend with the Ford Chief Justice, and another with the arch-community songster of Canterbury. The president of the Internal and External Secretions Corporation was perpetually on the phone, and she had been to Deauville with the deputy governor of the Bank of Europe. "It's wonderful, of course. And yet in a way," she had confessed to Fanny, "I feel as though I were getting something on false pretenses. Because, of course, the first thing they all want to know is what it's like to make love to a savage. And I have to say I don't know." She shook her head. "Most of the men don't believe me, of course. But it's true. I wish it weren't," she added sadly and sighed. "He's terribly good-looking, don't you think so?" "But doesn't he like you?" asked Fanny. "Sometimes I think he does and sometimes I think he doesn't. He always does his best to avoid me, goes out of the room when I come in, won't touch me, won't even look at me. But sometimes if I turn round suddenly, I catch him staring and then, well, you know how men look when they like you." Yes, Fanny knew. "I can't make it out," said Lenina. She couldn't make it out and not only was bewildered, was also rather upset. "Because, you see, Fanny, I like him. Liked him more and more. Well, now there'd be a real chance," she thought, as she scented herself after her bath. Dab, 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 a real chance. Her high spirits overflowed in song. "Hug me till you drug me, honey. Kiss me till I'm in a coma. Hug me, honey, snuggly bunny. Love's as good as soma." The scent organ was playing a delightfully refreshing herbal capriccio, rippling arpeggios of thyme and lavender, of rosemary, basil, myrtle, tarragon, a series of daring modulations through the spice keys into ambergris and a slow return through sandalwood, a camphor, cedar and new mown hay with occasional subtle touches of discord, a whiff of kidney pudding, the faintest suspicion of pig's dung, back to the simple aromatics with which the piece began. The final blast of time died away. There was a round of applause. The lights went up. In the synthetic music machine, the soundtrack roll began to unwind. It was a trio for hyperviolin, super cello and oboe surrogate that now filled the air with its agreeable languor. 30 or 40 bars, and then, against this instrumental background, a much more than human voice began to warble, now throaty, now from the head, now hollow as a flute, now charged with yearning harmonics. It effortlessly passed from Gaspard Forster's low record on the very frontiers of musical tone to a trilled bat note high above the highest C to which, in 1770, at the Ducal Opera of Parma, and to the astonishment of Mozart, Lucrezia Giugiaro, alone of all the singers in history, once piercingly gave utterance. Sunk in their pneumatic stalls, Lenina and the savage sniffed and listened. It was now the turn also for eyes and skin. The house lights went down, fiery letters stood out, solid and as though self-supported in the darkness. 3 weeks in a helicopter. An all-super singing, synthetic talking, colored, stereoscopic feely, with synchronized scent organ accompaniment. Take hold of those metal knobs on the arms of your chair, whispered Lenina. Otherwise you won't get any of the feely effects. The savage did as he was told. Those fiery letters, meanwhile, had disappeared. There were 10 seconds of complete darkness. Then suddenly, dazzling and incomparably more solid-looking than they would have seemed in actual flesh and blood, far more real than reality, there stood the stereoscopic images, locked in one another's arms, of a gigantic Negro and a golden-haired young brachycephalic beta plus female. The savage started, that sensation on his lips. He lifted a hand to his mouth. The titillation ceased. Let his hand fall back on the metal knob. It began again. The scent organ, meanwhile, breathed pure musk. Expiringly, a soundtrack superdove cooed, ooh-oh, and vibrating only 32 times a second, a deeper than African bass made answer, ah, ooh-ah, ooh-ah. The stereoscopic lips came together again. And once more the facial erogenous zones of the 6,000 spectators in the Alhambra tingled with almost intolerable galvanic pleasure. Ooh. The plot of the film was extremely simple. A few minutes after the first oohs and ahs, a duet, having been sung and a little love made on that famous bearskin, every hair of which, the assistant predestinator was perfectly right, could be separately and distinctly felt. The Negro had a helicopter accident, fell on his head. Thump. What a twinge through the forehead. A chorus of ahs and aes went up from the audience. The concussion knocked all the Negro's conditioning into a cocked hat. He developed for the beta blonde an exclusive and maniacal passion. She protested. He persisted. There were struggles, pursuits, an assault on arrival, finally. A sensational kidnapping. The beta blonde was ravished away into the sky and kept there, hovering for 3 weeks in a wildly anti-social tete-a-tete with the black madman. Finally, after a whole series of adventures and much aerial acrobacy, 3 handsome young alphas succeeded in rescuing her. The Negro was packed off to an adult reconditioning center, and the film ended happily and decorously, with the beta blonde becoming the mistress of all her 3 rescuers. They interrupted themselves for a moment to sing a synthetic quartet, with full super orchestral accompaniment and gardenias on the scent organ. Then the bearskin made a final appearance and, amid a blare of saxophones, the last stereoscopic kiss faded into darkness. The last electric titillation died on the lips, like a dying moth that quivers, ever more feebly, ever more faintly, and at last is quite still. But for Lenina the moth did not completely die. Even after the lights had gone up, while they were shuffling slowly along with the crowd towards the lifts, its ghost still fluttered against her lips, still traced fine, shuddering roads of anxiety and pleasure across her skin. Her cheeks were flushed, her eyes dewily bright, her breath came deeply. She caught hold of the savage's arm and pressed it, limp, against her side. He looked down at her for a moment, pale, pained, desiring, and ashamed of his desire. He was not worthy, not. Their eyes for a moment met. What treasures hers promised! A queen's ransom of temperament. Hastily he looked away, disengaged his imprisoned arm. He was obscurely terrified lest she should cease to be something he could feel himself unworthy of. I don't think you ought to see things like that, he said, making haste to transfer from Lenina herself to the surrounding circumstances the blame for any past or possible future lapse from perfection. Things like what, John? Like this horrible film. Horrible? Lenina was genuinely astonished. But I thought it was lovely. It was base, he said indignantly, it was ignoble. She shook her head. I don't know what you mean. Why was he so queer? Why did he go out of his way to spoil things? In the taxicopter he hardly even looked at her. Bound by strong vows that had never been pronounced, obedient to laws that had long since ceased to run, he sat averted and in silence. Sometimes, as though a finger had plucked at some taut, almost breaking string, his whole body would shake with a sudden nervous start. The taxicopter landed on the roof of Lenina's apartment house. At last, she thought exultantly as she stepped out of the cab. At last, even though he had been so queer just now. Standing under a lamp, she peered into her hand mirror. At last. Yes, her nose was a bit shiny. She shook the loose powder from her puff. While he was paying off the taxi, there would just be time. She rubbed at the shininess, thinking, he's terribly good looking. No need for him to be shy like Bernard. And yet, any other man would have done it long ago. Well, now at last. That fragment of a face in the little round mirror suddenly smiled at her. Good night, said a strangled voice behind her. Lenina wheeled round. He was standing in the doorway of the cab, his eyes fixed. Staring had evidently been staring all this time while she was powdering her nose. Waiting, but what for? Or hesitating, trying to make up his mind, and all the time thinking. Thinking, she could not imagine what extraordinary thoughts. Good night, Lenina, he repeated. And made a strange grimacing attempt to smile. But, John, I thought you were. I mean, aren't you? He shut the door and bent forward to say something to the driver. The cab shot up into the air. Looking down through the window in the floor, the savage could see Lenina's upturned face, pale in the bluish light of the lamps. The mouth was open, she was calling. Her foreshortened figure rushed away from him. The diminishing square of the roof seemed to be falling through the darkness. 5 minutes later he was back in his room. From its hiding place he took out his mouse-nibbled volume, turned with religious care its stained and crumpled pages, and began to read Othello. Othello, he remembered, was like the hero of 3 Weeks. In a helicopter, a black man. Drying her eyes, Lenina walked across the roof to the lift. On her way down to the 27th floor she pulled out her Soma bottle. 1 gram, she decided, would not be enough. Hers had been more than a 1 gram affliction. But if she took 2 grams, she ran the risk of not waking up in time tomorrow morning. She compromised and, into her cupped left palm, shook out 3 half-gram tablets. Chapter 12. Bernard had to shout through the locked door the savage would not open. But everybody's there, waiting for you. Let them wait, came back the muffled voice through the door. But you know quite well, John, how difficult it is to sound persuasive. At the top of one's voice, I asked them on purpose to meet you. You ought to have asked me first whether I wanted to meet them. But you always came before, John. That's precisely why I don't want to come again. Just to please me, Bernard bellowingly wheedled. Won't you come to please me? No. Do you seriously mean it? Yes. Despairingly, but what shall I do? Bernard wailed. Go to hell, bawled the exasperated voice from within. But the arch-community songster of Canterbury is there tonight. Bernard was almost in tears. Iya Takwa. It was only in Zuni that the savage could adequately express what he felt about the arch-community songster. Hanny, he added as an afterthought. And then with what derisive ferocity. Sons as Ozay na. And he spat on the ground, as Pape might have done. In the end Bernard had to slink back, diminished, to his rooms and inform the impatient assembly that the savage would not be appearing that evening. The news was received with indignation. The men were furious at having been tricked into behaving politely to this insignificant fellow, with the unsavory reputation and the heretical opinions. The higher their position in the hierarchy, the deeper their resentment. To play such a joke on me, the arch-songster kept repeating, on me. As for the women, they indignantly felt that they had been had on false pretenses. Had by a wretched little man who had had alcohol poured into his bottle by mistake. By a creature with a gamma- physique. It was an outrage, and they said so, more and more loudly. The head mistress of Eton was particularly scathing. Lenina alone said nothing. Pale, her blue eyes clouded with an unwanted melancholy. She sat in a corner, cut off from those who surrounded her by an emotion which they did not share. She had come to the party filled with a strange feeling of anxious exultation. In a few minutes, she had said to herself, as she entered the room, I shall be seeing him, talking to him, telling him, for she had come with her mind made up, that I like him more than anybody I've ever known. And then perhaps he'll say. What would he say? The blood had rushed to her cheeks. Why was he so strange the other night, after the feelies? So queer. And yet I'm absolutely sure he really does rather like me. I'm sure. It was at this moment that Bernard had made his announcement. The savage wasn't coming to the party. Lenina suddenly felt all the sensations normally experienced at the beginning of a violent passion surrogate treatment. A sense of dreadful emptiness, a breathless apprehension, a nausea. Her heart seemed to stop beating. Perhaps it's because he doesn't like me, she said to herself. And at once this possibility became an established certainty. John had refused to come because he didn't like her. He didn't like her. It really is a bit too thick, the head mistress of Eton was saying to the director of crematoria and phosphorus reclamation. When I think that I actually... Yes, came the voice of Fanny Crown, it's absolutely true about the alcohol. Someone I know knew someone who was working in the embryo store at the time. She said to my friend, and my friend said to me. Too bad, said Henry Foster, sympathizing with the arch community songster. It may interest you to know that our ex-director was on the point of transferring him to Iceland. Pierced by every word that was spoken. The tight balloon of Bernard's happy self-confidence was leaking from 1,000 wounds. Pale, distraught, abject and agitated, he moved among his guests, stammering incoherent apologies, assuring them that next time the savage would certainly be there, begging them to sit down and take a carotene sandwich, a slice of vitamin A pâté, a glass of champagne surrogate. They duly ate, but ignored him, drank, and were either rude to his face or talked to one another about him, loudly and offensively as though he had not been there. And now, my friends, said the arch community songster of Canterbury, in that beautiful ringing voice with which he led the proceedings at Ford's Day celebrations, now, my friends. I think perhaps the time has come. He rose, put down his glass, brushed from his purple viscose waistcoat the crumbs of a considerable collation, and walked towards the door. Bernard darted forward to intercept him. Must you really, arch songster? It's very early still. I'd hoped you would. Yes, what hadn't he hoped, when Lenina confidentially told him that the arch community songster would accept an invitation if it were sent. He's really rather sweet, you know. And she had shown Bernard the little golden zipper fastening in the form of a T, which the arch songster had given her as a memento of the weekend she had spent at the diocesan singery. To meet the arch community songster of Canterbury and Mr. Savage. Bernard had proclaimed his triumph on every invitation card. But the savage had chosen this evening of all evenings to lock himself up in his room, to shout Hanny, and even it was lucky that Bernard didn't understand Zuni sons as Ozay na. What should have been the crowning moment of Bernard's whole career had turned out to be the moment of his greatest humiliation. I'd so much hoped, he stammeringly repeated, looking up at the great dignitary with pleading and distracted eyes. My young friend, said the arch community songster in a tone of loud and solemn severity. There was a general silence. Let me give you a word of advice. He wagged his finger at Bernard. Before it's too late. A word of good advice. His voice became sepulchral. Mend your ways, my young friend, mend your ways. He made the sign of the T over him and turned away. Lenina, my dear, he called in another tone. Come with me. Obediently, but unsmiling and wholly insensible of the honor done to her without elation. Lenina walked after him, out of the room. The other guests followed at a respectful interval. The last of them slammed the door. Bernard was all alone. Punctured, utterly deflated, he dropped into a chair. And, covering his face with his hands, began to weep. A few minutes later, however, he thought better of it and took 4 tablets of soma. Upstairs in his room the savage was reading Romeo and Juliet. Lenina and the arch community songster stepped out onto the roof of the singery. Hurry up, my young friend, I mean, Lenina, called the arch songster impatiently from the lift gates. Lenina, who had lingered for a moment to look at the moon, dropped her eyes and came hurrying across the roof to rejoin him. A New Theory of Biology was the title of the paper, which Mustafa Mond had just finished reading. He sat for some time, meditatively frowning. then picked up his pen and wrote across the title page. The author's mathematical treatment of the conception of purpose is novel and highly ingenious, but heretical and, so far as the present social order is concerned, dangerous and potentially subversive. Not to be published. He underlined the words. The author will be kept under supervision. His transference to the marine biological station of St. Helena may become necessary. A pity, he thought, as he signed his name. It was a masterly piece of work. But once you began admitting explanations in terms of purpose, well, you didn't know what the result might be. It was the sort of idea that might easily decondition the more unsettled minds among the higher castes, make them lose their faith in happiness as the sovereign good and take to believing, instead, that the goal was somewhere beyond, somewhere outside the present human sphere. That the purpose of life was not the maintenance of well-being, but some intensification and refining of consciousness, some enlargement of knowledge. Which was, the controller reflected, quite possibly true, but not, in the present circumstance, admissible. He picked up his pen again, and under the words, not to be published, drew a second line. Thicker and blacker than the first, then sighed. What fun it would be, he thought, if one didn't have to think about happiness. With closed eyes, his face shining with rapture, John was softly declaiming to vacancy. Oh, she doth teach the torches to burn bright. It seems she hangs upon the cheek of night, like a rich jewel in an Ethiop's ear. Beauty too rich for use, for earth too dear. The golden tea lay shining on Lenina's bosom. Sportively, the arch-community songster caught hold of it. Sportively he pulled. I think, said Lenina suddenly, breaking a long silence, I'd better take a couple of grams of soma. Bernard, by this time, was fast asleep, and smiling at the private paradise of his dreams. Smiling, but inexorably, every 30 seconds, the minute hand of the electric clock above his bed jumped forward with an almost imperceptible click. Click, 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 click. And it was morning. Bernard was back among the miseries of space and time. It was in the lowest spirits that he taxied across to his work at the conditioning center. The intoxication of success had evaporated. He was soberly his old self. And by contrast with the temporary balloon of these last weeks, the old self seemed unprecedentedly heavier than the surrounding atmosphere. To this deflated Bernard the savage showed himself unexpectedly sympathetic. You're more like what you were at Malpais, he said, when Bernard had told him his plaintive story. Do you remember when we first talked together? Outside the little house. You're like what you were then. Because I'm unhappy again, that's why. Well, I'd rather be unhappy than have the sort of false, lying happiness you were having here. I like that, said Bernard bitterly. When it's you who were the cause of it all. Refusing to come to my party and so turning them all against me. He knew that what he was saying was absurd in its injustice. He admitted inwardly, and at last even aloud, the truth of all that the savage now said about the worthlessness of friends who could be turned upon so slight a provocation into persecuting enemies. But in spite of this knowledge and these admissions, in spite of the fact that his friends' support and sympathy were now his only comfort, Bernard continued perversely to nourish, along with his quite genuine affection, a secret grievance against the savage, to meditate a campaign of small revenges to be wreaked upon him. Nourishing a grievance against the arch-community songster was useless. There was no possibility of being revenge on the chief bottler or the assistant predestinator. As a victim, the savage possessed, for Bernard, this enormous superiority over the others that he was accessible. One of the principal functions of a friend is to suffer in a milder and symbolic form the punishments that we should like, but are unable, to inflict upon our enemies. Bernard's other victim friend was Helmholtz. When, discomfited, he came and asked once more for the friendship, which in his prosperity he had not thought it worth his while to preserve, Helmholtz gave it, and gave it without a reproach, without a comment, as though he had forgotten that there had ever been a quarrel. Touched, Bernard felt himself at the same time humiliated by this magnanimity. A magnanimity the more extraordinary and therefore the more humiliating in that it owed nothing to Soma and everything to Helmholtz's character. It was the Helmholtz of daily life who forgot and forgave, not the Helmholtz of a half-gram holiday. Bernard was duly grateful. It was an enormous comfort to have his friend again. And also duly resentful. It would be a pleasure to take some revenge on Helmholtz for his generosity. At their first meeting after the estrangement, Bernard poured out the tale of his miseries and accepted consolation. It was not till some days later that he learned, to his surprise, and with a twinge of shame, that he was not the only one who had been in trouble. Helmholtz had also come into conflict with authority. It was over some rhymes, he explained. I was giving my usual course of advanced emotional engineering for third-year students. 12 lectures, of which the 7th is about rhymes. On the use of rhymes in moral propaganda and advertisement, to be precise. I always illustrate my lecture with a lot of technical examples. This time I thought I'd give them one I'd just written myself. Pure madness, of course, but I couldn't resist it. He laughed. I was curious to see what their reactions would be. Besides, he added more gravely, I wanted to do a bit of propaganda. I was trying to engineer them into feeling as I'd felt when I wrote the rhymes. Ford. He laughed again. What an outcry there was. The principal had me up and threatened to hand me the immediate sack. I'm a marked man. But what were your rhymes? Bernard asked. They were about being alone. Bernard's eyebrows went up. I'll recite them to you, if you like. And Helmholtz began. Yesterday's committee. Sticks, but a broken drum. Midnight in the city. Flutes in a vacuum. Shut lips, sleeping faces. Every stopped machine. The dumb and littered places. Where crowds have been. All silences rejoice. Weep loudly or low. Speak, but with the voice. Of whom, I do not know. Absence, say, of Susans. Absence of Egerias. Arms and respective bosoms. Lips and, posteriors. Slowly form a presence. Whose? And, I ask, of what? So absurd in essence. That something, which is not. Nevertheless should populate. Empty night more solidly. Than that with which we copulate. Why should it seem so squalidly? Well, I gave them that as an example, and they reported me to the principal. I'm not surprised, said Bernard. It's flatly against all their sleep teaching. Remember, they've had at least 250,000 warnings against solitude. I know, but I thought I'd like to see what the effect would be. Well, you've seen now. Helmholtz only laughed. I feel, he said, after a silence, as though I were just beginning to have something to write about. As though I were beginning to be able to use that power. I feel I've got inside me, that extra, latent power. Something seems to be coming to me. In spite of all his troubles, he seemed, Bernard thought, profoundly happy. Helmholtz and the savage took to one another at once. So cordially indeed that Bernard felt a sharp pang of jealousy. In all these weeks he had never come to so close an intimacy with the savage as Helmholtz immediately achieved. Watching them, listening to their talk, he found himself sometimes resentfully wishing that he had never brought them together. He was ashamed of his jealousy and alternately made efforts of will, and took soma to keep himself from feeling it. But the efforts were not very successful, and between the soma holidays, there were, of necessity, intervals. The odious sentiment kept on returning. At his third meeting with the savage, Helmholtz recited his rhymes on solitude. What do you think of them? He asked when he had done. The savage shook his head. Listen to this, was his answer, and unlocking the drawer in which he kept his mouse-eaten book, he opened and read. Let the bird of loudest lay on the sole Arabian tree. Herald sad and trumpet be. Helmholtz listened with a growing excitement. At sole Arabian tree, he started at thou shrieking harbinger. He smiled with sudden pleasure at every fowl of tyrant wing. The blood rushed up into his cheeks. But at defunctive music, he turned pale and trembled with an unprecedented emotion. The savage read on. Property was thus appalled, that the self was not the same. Single nature's double name, neither two nor one was called. Reason in itself confounded, saw division grow together. Orgy porgy, said Bernard, interrupting the reading with a loud, unpleasant laugh. It's just a solidarity service hymn. He was revenging himself on his two friends for liking one another more than they liked him. In the course of their next 2 or 3 meetings, he frequently repeated this little act of vengeance. It was simple and, since both Helmholtz and the savage were dreadfully pained by the shattering and defilement of a favorite poetic crystal, extremely effective. In the end, Helmholtz threatened to kick him out of the room if he dared to interrupt again. And yet, strangely enough, the next interruption, the most disgraceful of all, came from Helmholtz himself. The savage was reading Romeo and Juliet aloud. reading for all the time he was seeing himself as Romeo and Lenina as Juliet. With an intense and quivering passion, Helmholtz had listened to the scene of the lovers' first meeting with a puzzled interest. The scene in the orchard had delighted him with its poetry, but the sentiments expressed had made him smile. Getting into such a state about having a girl, it seemed rather ridiculous. But taken detail by verbal detail, what a superb piece of emotional engineering. That old fellow, he said. He makes our best propaganda technicians look absolutely silly. The savage smiled triumphantly and resumed his reading. All went tolerably well until, in the last scene of the third act, Capulet and Lady Capulet began to bully Juliet to marry Paris. Helmholtz had been restless throughout the entire scene, but when, pathetically mimed by the savage, Juliet cried out, "Is there no pity sitting in the clouds, that sees into the bottom of my grief? Oh, sweet my mother, cast me not away. Delay this marriage for a month, a week. Or, if you do not, make the bridal bed in that dim monument where Tybalt lies." When Juliet said this, Helmholtz broke out in an explosion of uncontrollable guffawing. The mother and father grotesque obscenity forcing the daughter to have someone she didn't want. And the idiotic girl not saying that she was having someone else, whom for the moment, at any rate, she preferred. In its smutty absurdity the situation was irresistibly comical. He had managed, with a heroic effort, to hold down the mounting pressure of his hilarity. But, sweet mother, in the savage's tremulous tone of anguish, and the reference to Tybalt lying dead, but evidently uncremated and wasting his phosphorus on a dim monument, were too much for him. He laughed and laughed till the tears streamed down his face, quenchlessly laughed while, pale with a sense of outrage, the savage looked at him over the top of his book and then, as the laughter still continued, closed it indignantly, got up and, with the gesture of one who removes his pearl from before swine, locked it away in its drawer. "And yet," said Helmholtz when, having recovered breath enough to apologize, he had mollified the savage into listening to his explanations, "I know quite well that one needs ridiculous, mad situations like that. One can't write really well about anything else. Why was that old fellow such a marvelous propaganda technician? Because he had so many insane, excruciating things to get excited about. You've got to be hurt and upset, otherwise you can't think of the really good, penetrating, X-rayish phrases. But fathers and mothers," he shook his head, "you can't expect me to keep a straight face about fathers and mothers. And who's going to get excited about a boy having a girl or not having her?" The savage winced, but Helmholtz, who was staring pensively at the floor, saw nothing. "No," he concluded, with a sigh, "it won't do. We need some other kind of madness and violence." "But what? Where can one find it?" He was silent. Then, shaking his head, "I don't know," he said at last, "I don't know." Chapter 13. Henry Foster loomed up through the twilight of the embryo store. "Like to come to a feelie this evening?" Lenina shook her head without speaking. "Going out with someone else?" It interested him to know which of his friends was being had by which other. "Is it Benito?" he questioned. She shook her head again. Henry detected the weariness in those purple eyes, the pallor beneath that glaze of lupus, the sadness at the corners of the unsmiling crimson mouth. "You're not feeling ill, are you?" he asked, a trifle anxiously, afraid that she might be suffering from one of the few remaining infectious diseases. Yet once more Lenina shook her head. "Anyhow, you ought to go and see the doctor," said Henry. "A doctor a day keeps the jim-jams away," he added heartily, driving home his hypnopedic adage with a clap on the shoulder. "Perhaps you need a pregnancy substitute," he suggested, "or else an extra strong VPS treatment. Sometimes, you know, the standard passion surrogate isn't quite." "Oh, for Ford's sake," said Lenina, breaking her stubborn silence, "shut up." And she turned back to her neglected embryos. A VPS treatment indeed. She would have laughed, if she hadn't been on the point of crying. As though she hadn't got enough VP of her own. She sighed profoundly as she refilled her syringe. "John," she murmured to herself, "John." Then, my Ford, she wondered, have I given this one its sleeping sickness injection, or haven't I? She simply couldn't remember. In the end, she decided not to run the risk of letting it have a second dose, and moved down the line to the next bottle. 22 years 8 months and 4 days from that moment, A promising young alpha-administrator at Mwanza was to die of trypanosomiasis, the first case for over half a century. Sighing, Lenina went on with her work. An hour later, in the changing room, Fanny was energetically protesting. But it's absurd to let yourself get into a state like this. Simply absurd, she repeated. And what about? A man, one man. But he's the one I want. As though there weren't millions of other men in the world. But I don't want them. How can you know till you've tried? I have tried. But how many? Asked Fanny, shrugging her shoulders contemptuously. 1, 2, dozens. But, shaking her head, it wasn't any good, she added. Well, you must persevere, said Fanny sententiously. But it was obvious that her confidence in her own prescriptions had been shaken. Nothing can be achieved without perseverance. But meanwhile, don't think of him. I can't help it. Take Soma, then. I do. Well, go on. But in the intervals I still like him. I shall always like him. Well, if that's the case, said Fanny, with decision. Why don't you just go and take him? Whether he wants it or no. But if you knew how terribly queer he was. All the more reason for taking a firm line. It's all very well to say that. Don't stand any nonsense. Act. Fanny's voice was a trumpet. She might have been a YWFA lecturer giving an evening talk to adolescent beta-minuses. Yes, act, at once. Do it now. I'd be scared, said Lenina. Well, you've only got to take half a gram of Soma first. And now I'm going to have my bath. She marched off, trailing her towel. The bell rang, and the savage, who was impatiently hoping that Helmholtz would come that afternoon for having at last made up his mind to talk to Helmholtz about Lenina. He could not bear to postpone his confidences a moment longer, jumped up and ran to the door. I had a premonition it was you, Helmholtz, he shouted as he opened. On the threshold, in a white acetate satin sailor suit, and with a round white cap rakishly tilted over her left ear, stood Lenina. Oh, said the savage, as though someone had struck him a heavy blow. Half a gram had been enough to make Lenina forget her fears and her embarrassments. Hello, John, she said, smiling, and walked past him into the room. Automatically he closed the door and followed her. Lenina sat down. There was a long silence. You don't seem very glad to see me, John, she said at last. Not glad? The savage looked at her reproachfully. Then suddenly fell on his knees before her and, taking Lenina's hand, reverently kissed it. Not glad? Oh, if you only knew, he whispered, and, venturing to raise his eyes to her face. Admired Lenina, he went on. Indeed, the top of admiration, worth what's dearest in the world. She smiled at him with a luscious tenderness. Oh, you so perfect, she was leaning towards him with parted lips, so perfect and so peerless are created, nearer and nearer, of every creature's best. Still nearer. The savage suddenly scrambled to his feet. That's why, he said, speaking with averted face, I wanted to do something first. I mean, to show I was worthy of you. Not that I could ever really be that. But at any rate to show I wasn't absolutely unworthy. I wanted to do something. Why should you think it necessary? Lenina began, but left the sentence unfinished. There was a note of irritation in her voice. When one has leant forward, nearer and nearer, with parted lips, only to find oneself, quite suddenly, as a clumsy oaf scrambles to his feet, leaning towards nothing at all. Well, there is a reason, even with half a gram of Soma circulating in one's bloodstream, a genuine reason for annoyance. At Malpais, the savage was incoherently mumbling, you had to bring her the skin of a mountain lion. I mean, when you wanted to marry someone. Or else a wolf. There aren't any lions in England, Lenina almost snapped. And even if there were, the savage added, with sudden contemptuous resentment. People would kill them out of helicopters, I suppose. With poison gas or something. I wouldn't do that, Lenina. He squared his shoulders, he ventured to look at her. And was met with a stare of annoyed incomprehension. Confused, I'll do anything, he went on, more and more incoherently. Anything you tell me. There be some sports are painful you know. But their labor delight in them sets off. That's what I feel. I mean I'd sweep the floor if you wanted. But we've got vacuum cleaners here, said Lenina in bewilderment. It isn't necessary. No, of course it isn't necessary. But some kinds of baseness are nobly undergone. I'd like to undergo something nobly. Don't you see? But if there are vacuum cleaners, That's not the point. And epsilon semi-morons to work them, she went on. Well, really, why? Why? But for you. Just to show that I. And what on earth vacuum cleaners have got to do with lions? To show how much. Are lions with being glad to see me? She was getting more and more exasperated. How much I love you, Lenina, he brought out almost desperately. An emblem of the inner tide of startled elation. The blood rushed up into Lenina's cheeks. Do you mean it, John? But I hadn't meant to say so, cried the savage, clasping his hands in a kind of agony. Not until. Listen, Lenina in Malpais people get married. Get what? The irritation had begun to creep back into her voice. What was he talking about now? For always. They make a promise to live together for always. What a horrible idea. Lenina was genuinely shocked. Outliving beauty's outward, with a mind that doth renew swifter than blood decays. What? It's like that in Shakespeare too. If thou dost break her virgin knot before all sanctimonious ceremonies, may with full and holy right. For Ford's sake, John, talk sense. I can't understand a word you say. First it's vacuum cleaners, then it's knots. You're driving me crazy. She jumped up and, as though afraid that he might run away from her physically, as well as with his mind, caught him by the wrist. Answer me this question: do you really like me, or don't you? There was a moment's silence, then. In a very low voice, I love you more than anything in the world, he said. Then why on earth didn't you say so? She cried. And so intense was her exasperation that she drove her sharp nails into the skin of his wrist. Instead of driveling away about knots and vacuum cleaners and lions and making me miserable for weeks and weeks. She released his hand and flung it angrily away from her. If I didn't like you so much, she said, I'd be furious with you. And suddenly her arms were round his neck. He felt her lips soft against his own. So deliciously soft, so warm and electric that inevitably he found himself thinking of the embraces in 3 weeks in a helicopter. Ooh, the stereoscopic blonde and the more than real blackamoor. Horror. He tried to disengage himself, but Lenina tightened her embrace. Why didn't you say so? She whispered, drawing back her face to look at him. Her eyes were tenderly reproachful. The murkiest den, the most opportune place, the voice of conscience thundered poetically. The strongest suggestion our worser genius can, shall never melt mine honor into lust. Never, he resolved. You silly boy, she was saying. I wanted you so much. And if you wanted me too, why didn't you? But, Lenina, he began protesting, and as she immediately untwined her arms, as she stepped away from him, he thought, for a moment, that she had taken his unspoken hint. But when she unbuckled her white patent cartridge belt and hung it carefully over the back of a chair, he began to suspect that he had been mistaken. Lenina, he repeated apprehensively. She put her hand to her neck and gave a long vertical pull. Her white sailor's blouse was ripped to the hem, suspicion condensed into a too solid certainty. Lenina, what are you doing? Zip. Her answer was wordless. She stepped out of her bell-bottomed trousers. Her zippitsa miknicks were a pale shell pink. The arch community songster's golden tea dangled at her breast. For those milk paps that through the window bars bore at men's eyes. The singing, thundering, magical words made her seem doubly dangerous, doubly alluring. Soft, but how piercing. Boring and drilling into reason, tunneling through resolution. The strongest oaths are straw to the fire. The blood. Be more abstemious, or else. Zip. The rounded pinkness fell apart like a neatly divided apple. A wriggle of the arms, a lifting first of the right foot, then the left. The zippitsa miknicks were lying lifeless and as though deflated on the floor. Still wearing her shoes and socks, and her rakishly tilted round white cap, she advanced towards him. Darling, if only you'd said so before. She held out her arms. But instead of also saying, darling, and holding out his arms, the savage retreated in terror, flapping his hands at her, as though he were trying to scare away some intruding and dangerous animal. 4 backward steps, and he was brought to bay against the wall. Sweet, said Lenina and, laying her hands on his shoulders, pressed herself against him. Put your arms round me, she commanded. Hug me till you drug me, honey. She too had poetry at her command. New words that sang and were spells and beat drums. Kiss me. She closed her eyes. She let her voice sink to a sleepy murmur. Kiss me till I'm in a coma. Hug me, honey, snuggly. The savage caught her by the wrists, tore her hands from his shoulders, thrust her roughly away at arm's length. Ow, you're hurting me, you're. She was suddenly silent. Terror had made her forget the pain. Opening her eyes, she had seen his face, no, not his face, a ferocious stranger's, pale, distorted, twitching with some insane, inexplicable fury. Aghast, but what is it, John? She whispered. He did not answer, but only stared into her face with those mad eyes. The hands that held her wrists were trembling. He breathed deeply and irregularly. Faint almost to imperceptibility, but appalling. She suddenly heard the grinding of his teeth. What is it? She almost screamed. And as though awakened by her cry, he caught her by the shoulders and shook her. Whore, he shouted. Whore. Impudent strumpet. Oh, don't. She protested in a voice made grotesquely tremulous by his shaking. Whore. Please. Damned whore. A grand ame is better. She began. The savage pushed her away with such force that she staggered and fell. Go, he shouted, standing over her menacingly, get out of my sight, or I'll kill you. He clenched his fists. Lenina raised her arm to cover her face. No, please don't, John. Hurry up, quick. One arm still raised, and following his every movement with a terrified eye, she scrambled to her feet and still crouching, still covering her head, made a dash for the bathroom. The noise of that prodigious slap by which her departure was accelerated was like a pistol shot. Ow! Lenina bounded forward. Safely locked into the bathroom, she had leisure to take stock of her injuries. Standing with her back to the mirror, she twisted her head. Looking over her left shoulder, she could see the imprint of an open hand standing out, distinct and crimson on the pearly flesh. Gingerly she rubbed the wounded spot. Outside, in the other room, the savage was striding up and down, marching to the drums and music of magical words. The wren goes tote, and the small gilded fly does lecher in my sight. Maddeningly they rumbled in his ears. The fichu nor the soiled horse goes tote with a more riotous appetite. Down from the waist they are centaurs, though women all above. But to the girdle do the gods inherit. Beneath is all the fiends. There's hell, there's darkness. There is the sulphurous pit, burning, scalding, stench, consumption. Fie, paw. Give me an ounce of civet, good apothecary, to sweeten my imagination. John, ventured a small ingratiating voice from the bathroom. John, O thou weed, who art so lovely fair and smell'st so sweet, that the sense aches at thee. Was this most goodly book made to write, whore, upon? Heaven stops the nose at it. But her perfume still hung about him, his jacket was white, with the powder that had scented her velvety body. Impudent strumpet, impudent strumpet, impudent strumpet. The inexorable rhythm beat itself out. Impudent. John, do you think I might have my clothes? He picked up the bell-bottomed trousers, the blouse, the zipitsa mikniks. Open, he ordered, kicking the door. No, I won't. The voice was frightened and defiant. Well, how do you expect me to give them to you? Push them through the ventilator over the door. He did what she suggested and returned to his uneasy pacing of the room. Impudent strumpet, impudent strumpet. The devil luxury with his fat rump and potato finger. John. He would not answer. Fat rump and potato finger. John. What is it? He asked gruffly. I wonder if you'd mind giving me my Malthusian belt. Lenina sat listening to the footsteps in the other room, wondering, as she listened, how long he was likely to go tramping up and down like that, whether she would have to wait until he left the flat, or if it would be safe, after allowing his madness a reasonable time to subside, to open the bathroom door and make a dash for it. She was interrupted in the midst of these uneasy speculations by the sound of the telephone bell ringing in the other room. Abruptly the tramping ceased. She heard the voice of the savage parleying with silence. Hello. Yes. If I do not usurp myself, I am. Yes, didn't you hear me say so? Mr. Savage speaking. What? Who's ill? Of course it interests me. But is it serious? Is she really bad? I'll go at once. Not in her rooms anymore? Where has she been taken? Oh, my God. What's the address? 3 Park Lane, is that it? 3? Thanks. Lenina heard the click of the replaced receiver, then hurrying steps. A door slammed. There was silence. Was he really gone? With an infinity of precautions she opened the door. A quarter of an inch peeped through the crack, was encouraged by the view of emptiness, opened a little further, and put her whole head out, finally tiptoed into the room, stood for a few seconds with strongly beating heart, listening, then darted to the front door, opened, slipped through, slammed, ran. It was not till she was in the lift, and actually dropping down the well, that she began to feel herself secure. Chapter 14. The Park Lane Hospital for the Dying was a 60-story tower of primrose tiles. As the savage stepped out of his taxicopter, a convoy of gaily colored aerial hearses rose, whirring from the roof, and darted away across the park, westwards, bound for the Slough crematorium. At the lift gates the presiding porter gave him the information he required, and he dropped down to Ward 81, a galloping senility ward, the porter explained, on the 17th floor. It was a large room, bright with sunshine and yellow paint, and containing 20 beds, all occupied. Linda was dying in company, and with all the modern conveniences. The air was continuously alive with gay synthetic melodies. At the foot of every bed, confronting its moribund occupant, was a television box. Television was left on, a running tap, from morning till night. Every quarter of an hour, the prevailing perfume of the room was automatically changed. "We try," explained the nurse, who had taken charge of the savage at the door. "We try to create a thoroughly pleasant atmosphere here. Something between a first-class hotel and a feely palace, if you take my meaning." "Where is she?" asked the savage, ignoring these polite explanations. The nurse was offended. "You are in a hurry," she said. "Is there any hope?" he asked. "You mean, of her not dying?" He nodded. "No, of course there isn't. When somebody's sent here, there's no." Startled by the expression of distress on his pale face, she suddenly broke off. "Why, whatever is the matter?" she asked. She was not accustomed to this kind of thing in visitors. Not that there were many visitors anyhow, or any reason why there should be many visitors. "You're not feeling ill, are you?" He shook his head. "She's my mother," he said in a scarcely audible voice. The nurse glanced at him with startled, horrified eyes, then quickly looked away. From throat to temple she was all one hot blush. "Take me to her," said the savage, making an effort to speak in an ordinary tone. Still blushing, she led the way down the ward. Faces still fresh and unwithered, for senility galloped so hard that it had no time to age the cheeks, only the heart and brain turned as they passed. Their progress was followed by the blank, incurious eyes of second infancy. The savage shuddered as he looked. Linda was lying in the last of the long row of beds, next to the wall. Propped up on pillows, she was watching the semifinals of the South American Reman Surface Tennis Championship, which were being played in silent and diminished reproduction on the screen of the television box. At the foot of the bed, hither and thither across their square of illumined glass, the little figures noiselessly darted, like fish in an aquarium, the silent but agitated inhabitants of another world. Linda looked on, vaguely and uncomprehendingly smiling. Her pale, bloated face wore an expression of imbecile happiness. Every now and then her eyelids closed, and for a few seconds she seemed to be dozing. Then with a little start she would wake up again. Wake up to the aquarium antics of the tennis champions, to the Super Vox Wurlitzeriana rendering of "Hug me till you drug me, honey," to the warm draft of verbena that came blowing through the ventilator above her head. Would wake to these things, or rather to a dream of which these things, transformed and embellished by the soma in her blood, were the marvelous constituents, and smile once more her broken and discolored smile of infantile contentment. "Well, I must go," said the nurse. "I've got my batch of children coming. Besides, there's number 3. She pointed up the ward. "Might go off any minute now." "Well, make yourself comfortable." She walked briskly away. The savage sat down beside the bed. "Linda," he whispered, taking her hand. At the sound of her name, she turned. Her vague eyes brightened with recognition. She squeezed his hand, she smiled, her lips moved, then quite suddenly her head fell forward. She was asleep. He sat watching her, seeking through the tired flesh. Seeking and finding that young, bright face, which had stooped over his childhood in Malpais, remembering, and he closed his eyes, her voice, her movements, all the events of their life together. Streptocock G to Banbury T. How beautiful her singing had been. And those childish rhymes, how magically strange and mysterious. A, B, C, vitamin D. The fats in the liver, the cods in the sea. He felt the hot tears welling up behind his eyelids, as he recalled the words and Linda's voice as she repeated them. And then the reading lessons, the tot is in the pot. The cat is on the mat, and the elementary instructions for beta workers in the embryo store. And long evenings by the fire or, in summertime, on the roof of the little house. When she told him those stories about the other place, outside the reservation, that beautiful, beautiful other place, whose memory, as of a heaven, a paradise of goodness and loveliness, he still kept whole and intact, undefiled by contact with the reality of this real London, these actual civilized men and women. A sudden noise of shrill voices made him open his eyes and, after hastily brushing away the tears, look round. What seemed an interminable stream of identical 8-year-old male twins was pouring into the room. Twin after twin, twin after twin, they came, a nightmare. Their faces, their repeated face, for there was only one between the lot of them, puggishly stared, all nostrils and pale goggling eyes. Their uniform was khaki. All their mouths hung open. Squealing and chattering they entered. In a moment, it seemed, the ward was maggoty with them. They swarmed between the beds, clambered over, crawled under, peeped into the television boxes, made faces at the patients. Linda astonished and rather alarmed them. A group stood clustered at the foot of her bed, staring with the frightened and stupid curiosity of animals suddenly confronted by the unknown. "Oh, look, look." They spoke in low, scared voices. "Whatever is the matter with her? Why is she so fat?" They had never seen a face like hers before. Had never seen a face that was not youthful and taut-skinned, a body that had ceased to be slim and upright. All these moribund sexagenarians had the appearance of childish girls. At 44, Linda seemed, by contrast, a monster of flaccid and distorted senility. "Isn't she awful?" came the whispered comments. "Look at her teeth." Suddenly from under the bed a pug-faced twin popped up between John's chair and the wall, and began peering into Linda's sleeping face. "I say," he began, but his sentence ended prematurely in a squeal. The savage had seized him by the collar, lifted him clear over the chair and, with a smart box on the ears, sent him howling away. His yells brought the head nurse hurrying to the rescue. "What have you been doing to him?" she demanded fiercely. "I won't have you striking the children." "Well, then, keep them away from this bed." The savage's voice was trembling with indignation. "What are these filthy little brats doing here at all? It's disgraceful." "Disgraceful? But what do you mean?" "They're being death-conditioned. And I tell you," she warned him truculently, "if I have any more of your interference with their conditioning, I'll send for the porters and have you thrown out." The savage rose to his feet and took a couple of steps towards her. His movements and the expression on his face were so menacing that the nurse fell back in terror. With a great effort he checked himself and, without speaking, turned away and sat down again by the bed. Reassured, but with a dignity that was a trifle shrill and uncertain. "I've warned you," said the nurse, "so mind." Still, she led the two inquisitive twins away, and made them join in the game of Hunt the Zipper, which had been organized by one of her colleagues at the other end of the room. "Run along now and have your cup of caffeine solution, dear," she said to the other nurse. The exercise of authority restored her confidence, made her feel better. "Now, children," she called. Linda had stirred uneasily, had opened her eyes for a moment, looked vaguely around, and then once more dropped off to sleep. Sitting beside her, the savage tried hard to recapture his mood of a few minutes before. "A, B, C, vitamin D," he repeated to himself, as though the words were a spell that would restore the dead past to life. But the spell was ineffective. Obstinately the beautiful memories refused to rise. There was only a hateful resurrection of jealousies and uglinesses and miseries. Pape with the blood trickling down from his cut shoulder and Linda hideously asleep. And the flies buzzing round the spilt mezcal on the floor beside the bed and the boys, calling those names as she passed. Ah, no, no. He shut his eyes. He shook his head in strenuous denial of these memories. A, B, C, vitamin D. He tried to think of those times when he sat on her knees, and she put her arms about him and sang, over and over again, rocking him to sleep. A, B, C, vitamin D, vitamin D, vitamin D. The super vox whirlet Siriana had risen to a sobbing crescendo. and suddenly the verbena gave place, in the scent circulating system, to an intense patchouli. Linda stirred, woke up, stared for a few seconds. Bewilderedly at the semifinalists, then, lifting her face, sniffed once or twice at the newly perfumed air and suddenly smiled, a smile of childish ecstasy. "Pape," she murmured, and closed her eyes. "Oh, I do so like it, I do." She sighed and let herself sink back into the pillows. "But, Linda," the savage spoke imploringly, "don't you know me?" He had tried so hard, had done his very best, why wouldn't she allow him to forget? He squeezed her limp hand almost with violence, as though he would force her to come back from this dream of ignoble pleasures, from these base and hateful memories, back into the present, back into reality, the appalling present, the awful reality, but sublime, but significant, but desperately important precisely because of the imminence of that, which made them so fearful. "Don't you know me, Linda?" He felt the faint answering pressure of her hand. The tears started into his eyes. He bent over her and kissed her. Her lips moved. "Pape," she whispered again, and it was as though he had had a pailful of ordure thrown in his face. Anger suddenly boiled up in him. Balked for the second time, the passion of his grief had found another outlet, was transformed into a passion of agonized rage. "But I'm John," he shouted. "I'm John." And in his furious misery, he actually caught her by the shoulder and shook her. Linda's eyes fluttered open. She saw him, knew him, John, but situated the real face, the real and violent hands, in an imaginary world, among the inward and private equivalents of patchouli, and the super-Wurlitzer, among the transfigured memories, and the strangely transposed sensations that constituted the universe of her dream. She knew him for John, her son, but fancied him an intruder into that paradisal Malpai where she had been spending her summer holiday with Pape. He was angry because she liked Pape. He was shaking her because Pape was there in the bed, as though there were something wrong. As though all civilized people didn't do the same? Everyone belongs to every. Her voice suddenly died into an almost inaudible breathless croaking. Her mouth fell open. She made a desperate effort to fill her lungs with air. But it was as though she had forgotten how to breathe. She tried to cry out, but no sound came. Only the terror of her staring eyes revealed what she was suffering. Her hands went to her throat, then clawed at the air. The air she could no longer breathe, the air that, for her, had ceased to exist. The savage was on his feet, bent over her. "What is it, Linda? What is it?" His voice was imploring. It was as though he were begging to be reassured. The look she gave him was charged with an unspeakable terror, with terror, and, it seemed to him, reproach. She tried to raise herself in bed, but fell back onto the pillows. Her face was horribly distorted, her lips blue. The savage turned and ran up the ward. "Quick, quick," he shouted. "Quick." Standing in the center of a ring of zipper-hunting twins, the head nurse looked round. The first moment's astonishment gave place almost instantly to disapproval. "Don't shout. Think of the little ones," she said, frowning. "You might decondition. But what are you doing?" He had broken through the ring. "Be careful." A child was yelling. "Quick, quick." He caught her by the sleeve, dragged her after him. "Quick. Something's happened. I've killed her." By the time they were back at the end of the ward, Linda was dead. The savage stood for a moment in frozen silence, then fell on his knees beside the bed and, covering his face with his hands, sobbed uncontrollably. The nurse stood irresolute, looking now at the kneeling figure by the bed, the scandalous exhibition, and now, poor children, at the twins, who had stopped their hunting of the zipper and were staring from the other end of the ward. Staring with all their eyes and nostrils at the shocking scene that was being enacted round bed 20. Should she speak to him? Try to bring him back to a sense of decency? Remind him of where he was? Of what fatal mischief he might do to these poor innocents? Undoing all their wholesome death conditioning, with this disgusting outcry, as though death were something terrible. As though anyone mattered as much as all that. It might give them the most disastrous ideas about the subject, might upset them into reacting in the entirely wrong, the utterly antisocial way. She stepped forward, she touched him on the shoulder. "Can't you behave?" she said in a low, angry voice. But, looking round, she saw that half a dozen twins were already on their feet, and advancing down the ward. The circle was disintegrating. In another moment. No, the risk was too great. The whole group might be put back 6 or 7 months in its conditioning. She hurried back towards her menaced charges. "Now, who wants a chocolate eclair?" she asked in a loud, cheerful tone. "Me," yelled the entire Bokanovsky group in chorus. Bed 20 was completely forgotten. "Oh, God, God, God," the savage kept repeating to himself. In the chaos of grief and remorse that filled his mind, it was the one articulate word. "God," he whispered it aloud. "God, whatever is he saying?" said a voice, very near, distinct, and shrill through the warblings of the Super Wurlitzer. The savage violently started and, uncovering his face, looked round. 5 khaki twins, each with the stump of a long eclair in his right hand, and their identical faces variously smeared with liquid chocolate, were standing in a row, huggily goggling at him. They met his eyes and simultaneously grinned. One of them pointed with his eclair butt. "Is she dead?" he asked. The savage stared at them for a moment in silence. Then, in silence he rose to his feet, in silence slowly walked towards the door. "Is she dead?" repeated the inquisitive twin trotting at his side. The savage looked down at him and still without speaking pushed him away. The twin fell on the floor and at once began to howl. The savage did not even look round. Chapter 15. The menial staff of the Park Lane Hospital for the Dying consisted of 162 deltas, divided into 2 Bokanovsky groups of 84 red-headed female and 78 dark dolichocephalic male twins, respectively. At 6, when their working day was over, the 2 groups assembled in the vestibule of the hospital, and were served by the deputy sub-bursar with their soma ration. From the lift the savage stepped out into the midst of them. But his mind was elsewhere, with death, with his grief, and his remorse mechanically, without consciousness of what he was doing. He began to shoulder his way through the crowd. "Who are you pushing? Where do you think you're going?" High, low, from a multitude of separate throats. Only 2 voices squeaked or growled. Repeated indefinitely, as though by a train of mirrors, 2 faces, one a hairless and freckled moon haloed in orange, the other a thin, beaked bird mask, stubbily with 2 days' beard, turned angrily towards him. Their words and, in his ribs, the sharp nudging of elbows, broke through his unawareness. He woke once more to external reality, looked round him, knew what he saw, knew it, with a sinking sense of horror and disgust, for the recurrent delirium of his days and nights, the nightmare of swarming indistinguishable sameness. Twins, twins. Like maggots they had swarmed defilingly over the mystery of Linda's death. Maggots again, but larger, full-grown. They now crawled across his grief and his repentance. He halted and, with bewildered and horrified eyes, stared round him at the khaki mob, in the midst of which, overtopping it by a full head, he stood. "How many goodly creatures are there here?" The singing words mocked him derisively. "How beauteous mankind is, O brave new world." "Soma distribution," shouted a loud voice. "In good order, please. Hurry up there." A door had been opened, a table and chair carried into the vestibule. The voice was that of a jaunty young alpha, who had entered carrying a black iron cash box. A murmur of satisfaction went up from the expectant twins. They forgot all about the savage. Their attention was now focused on the black cash box, which the young man had placed on the table, and was now in process of unlocking. The lid was lifted. "Ooh-oh," said all the 162 simultaneously, as though they were looking at fireworks. The young man took out a handful of tiny pillboxes. "Now," he said peremptorily, "step forward, please. One at a time, and no shoving." One at a time, with no shoving, the twins stepped forward. First 2 males, then a female, then another male, then 3 females, then. The savage stood looking on. "O brave new world, O brave new world." In his mind the singing words seemed to change their tone. They had mocked him through his misery and remorse. Mocked him with how hideous a note of cynical derision. Fiendishly laughing, they had insisted on the low squalor, the nauseous ugliness of the nightmare. Now, suddenly, they trumpeted a call to arms. O brave new world. Miranda was proclaiming the possibility of loveliness. The possibility of transforming even the nightmare into something fine and noble. O brave new world. It was a challenge, a command. "No shoving there, now," shouted the deputy sub-bursar in a fury. He slammed down the lid of his cash box. "I shall stop the distribution unless I have good behavior." The deltas muttered, jostled one another a little, and then were still. The threat had been effective. Deprivation of soma, appalling thought. That's better, said the young man, and reopened his cash box. Linda had been a slave, Linda had died. Others should live in freedom, and the world be made beautiful. A reparation, a duty. And suddenly it was luminously clear to the savage what he must do. It was as though a shutter had been opened, a curtain drawn back. Now, said the deputy bursar. Another khaki female stepped forward. Stop, called the savage in a loud and ringing voice. Stop. He pushed his way to the table. The deltas stared at him with astonishment. Ford, said the deputy sub-bursar, below his breath. It's the savage. He felt scared. Listen, I beg you, cried the savage earnestly. Lend me your ears. He had never spoken in public before, and found it very difficult to express what he wanted to say. Don't take that horrible stuff. It's poison, it's poison. I say, Mr. Savage, said the deputy sub-bursar, smiling propitiatingly. Would you mind letting me? Poison to soul as well as body. Yes, but let me get on with my distribution, won't you? There's a good fellow. With the cautious tenderness of one who strokes a notoriously vicious animal. He patted the savage's arm. Just let me. Never, cried the savage. But look here, old man. Throw it all away, that horrible poison. The words, throw it all away, pierced through the enfolding layers of incomprehension to the quick of the delta's consciousness. An angry murmur went up from the crowd. I come to bring you freedom, said the savage, turning back towards the twins. I come. The deputy sub-bursar heard no more. He had slipped out of the vestibule and was looking up a number in the telephone book. Not in his own rooms, Bernard summed up. Not in mine, not in yours. Not at the Aphroditeum, not at the center or the college. Where can he have got to? Helmholtz shrugged his shoulders. They had come back from their work, expecting to find the savage waiting for them at one or other of their usual meeting places, and there was no sign of the fellow. Which was annoying, as they had meant to nip across to Biarritz in Helmholtz's four-seater sporticopter. They'd be late for dinner if he didn't come soon. We'll give him 5 more minutes, said Helmholtz. If he doesn't turn up by then, we'll. The ringing of the telephone bell interrupted him. He picked up the receiver. Hello. Speaking. Then, after a long interval of listening, Ford in Flivver, he swore. I'll come at once. What is it? Bernard asked. A fellow I know at the Park Lane Hospital, said Helmholtz. The savage is there. Seems to have gone mad. Anyhow, it's urgent. Will you come with me? Together they hurried along the corridor to the lifts. But do you like being slaves? The savage was saying, as they entered the hospital. His face was flushed, his eyes bright with ardor and indignation. Do you like being babies? Yes, babies. Mewling and puking, he added, exasperated by their bestial stupidity into throwing insults at those he had come to save. The insults bounced off their carapace of thick stupidity. They stared at him with a blank expression of dull and sullen resentment in their eyes. Yes, puking, he fairly shouted. Grief and remorse, compassion and duty, all were forgotten now and, as it were, absorbed into an intense overpowering hatred of these less than human monsters. Don't you want to be free and men? Don't you even understand what manhood and freedom are? Rage was making him fluent, the words came easily, in a rush. Don't you? He repeated, but got no answer to his question. Very well, then, he went on grimly. I'll teach you, I'll make you be free whether you want to or not. And pushing open a window that looked on to the inner court of the hospital, he began to throw the little pillboxes of soma tablets in handfuls out into the area. For a moment the khaki mob was silent, petrified at the spectacle of this wanton sacrilege, with amazement and horror. He's mad, whispered Bernard, staring with wide-open eyes. They'll kill him. They'll. A great shout suddenly went up from the mob. A wave of movement drove it menacingly towards the savage. Ford help him, said Bernard, and averted his eyes. Ford helps those who help themselves. And with a laugh, actually a laugh of exultation, Helmholtz Watson pushed his way through the crowd. Free, free, the savage shouted, and with one hand continued to throw the soma into the area while, with the other, he punched the indistinguishable faces of his assailants free. And suddenly there was Helmholtz at his side. Good old Helmholtz, also punching men at last, and in the interval also throwing the poison out by handfuls through the open window. Yes, men, men, and there was no more poison left. He picked up the cash box and showed them its black emptiness. You're free. Howling, the Deltas charged with a redoubled fury. Hesitant on the fringes of the battle. They're done for, said Bernard and, urged by a sudden impulse, ran forward to help them, then thought better of it and halted, then, ashamed, stepped forward again. Then again thought better of it, and was standing in an agony of humiliated indecision, thinking that they might be killed if he didn't help them, and that he might be killed if he did. When Ford be praised, goggle-eyed and swine-snouted in their gas masks, in ran the police. Bernard dashed to meet them. He waved his arms and it was action, he was doing something. He shouted, "Help," several times, more and more loudly, so as to give himself the illusion of helping. Help, help, help. The policemen pushed him out of the way and got on with their work. 3 men with spraying machines buckled to their shoulders, pumped thick clouds of soma vapor into the air. 2 more were busy round the portable synthetic music box, carrying water pistols charged with a powerful anesthetic. 4 others had pushed their way into the crowd and were methodically laying out, squirt by squirt. The more ferocious of the fighters. Quick, quick, yelled Bernard. They'll be killed if you don't hurry. They'll. Oh. Annoyed by his chatter, one of the policemen had given him a shot from his water pistol. Bernard stood for a second or two wobbling unsteadily on legs that seemed to have lost their bones, their tendons, their muscles, to have become mere sticks of jelly, and at last not even jelly, water. He tumbled in a heap on the floor. Suddenly, from out of the synthetic music box a voice began to speak. The voice of reason, the voice of good feeling. The soundtrack roll was unwinding itself in synthetic anti-riot speech. Number 2 medium strength. Straight from the depths of a non-existent heart. My friends, said the voice so pathetically, with a note of such infinitely tender reproach that, behind their gas masks, even the policemen's eyes were momentarily dimmed with tears. What is the meaning of this? Why aren't you all being happy and good together? Happy and good, the voice repeated. At peace, at peace. It trembled, sank into a whisper and momentarily expired. Oh, I do want you to be happy, it began, with a yearning earnestness. I do so want you to be good. Please, please be good. And 2 minutes later the voice and the soma vapor had produced their effect. In tears, the Deltas were kissing and hugging one another. 6 twins at a time in a comprehensive embrace. Even Helmholtz and the Savage were almost crying. A fresh supply of pillboxes was brought in from the bursary. A new distribution was hastily made and, to the sound of the voice's richly affectionate, baritone valedictions, the twins dispersed, blubbering as though their hearts would break. Goodbye, my dearest, dearest friends, Ford keep you. Goodbye, my dearest, dearest friends. Ford keep you. Goodbye, my dearest, dearest. When the last of the Deltas had gone, the policeman switched off the current. The angelic voice fell silent. Will you come quietly? Asked the sergeant, or must we anesthetize? He pointed his water pistol menacingly. Oh, we'll come quietly, the Savage answered, dabbing alternately a cut lip, a scratched neck, and a bitten left hand. Still keeping his handkerchief to his bleeding nose, Helmholtz nodded in confirmation, awake and having recovered the use of his legs. Bernard had chosen this moment to move as inconspicuously as he could towards the door. Hi, you there, called the sergeant, and a swine-masked policeman hurried across the room and laid a hand on the young man's shoulder. Bernard turned with an expression of indignant innocence. Escaping? He hadn't dreamed of such a thing. Though what on earth you want me for, he said. To the sergeant, I really can't imagine. You're a friend of the prisoners, aren't you? Well, said Bernard, and hesitated. No, he really couldn't deny it. Why shouldn't I be? He asked. Come on, then, said the sergeant, and led the way towards the door and the waiting police car.